Marjorie Brown is on top of the world. Just 34 years old, she's at the pinnacle of her military career.
She loved people and she loved to help them. And that's part of the reason she went to the military. She was on orders consistently, and she went from E2, which is basically your beginning in the military, to Sergeant First Class in about 10 years. And Sergeant First Class is E7.
She was proud that day. The accomplishment of making E7 is not easy. I think she was really on a pace with the National Guard to run through the entire rank and make it all the way.
Everything was going perfectly. She was living life. Everything was moving right along on schedule. She was doing everything she had set out to do.
As does Staff Sergeant Roger Holland. Also 34, Roger is stationed at the same base as Marjorie, but they haven't crossed paths until now.
As far as when he came in the military, he knew his job. He knew how to lead troops.
I'll see you later. Yeah, I'll see you in a bit.
Congrats again, sweetheart.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Pop. Okay.
Marjorie's in a medical unit, and Roger's a fighter. Both are well respected in their fields, and quickly by one another.
First class sergeant. I'm impressed.
Are you here at the base?
I'm hoping to get to E7 myself. I guess you're kind of busy with your family right now?
I think they're about ready to call it a night, honestly.
Are you?
Depends.
Depends if you can find me later.
Okay.
She was a very beautiful woman, very intelligent. He was handsome, and so I could see them being drawn together.
She had like this smile that would light up a room. She had such spirit and drive. There was nothing she couldn't do. She could have been a model. She had the perfect little body. She could have walked the runway.
Just thought I'd say hello.
Well, don't be shy. Come on in. You're not married or anything, right?
Divorced. No kids.
Me too.
Oh. So that's my dad and my stepmom.
They both hail from tight-knit small towns. Marjorie from Minnesota and Roger from Missouri.
Oh, that's my other brother. He passed 18 years ago.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, he was hit by a train.
Margie has always been strong. We lost my brother in 1992. Margie and I would stay in contact no matter where we were.
That brought me and Jimmy closer together. So,
Tell me more about Jimmy.
he's amazing.
Yeah.
Roger was just an engaging person. He would not only speak about his own accomplishments, but he would listen to other people's accomplishments, like he was truly interested in them. He enjoyed conversations with people and engaging and connecting with them, and he was an easy person to get to know. He was easy to be around.
Roger soon begins spending time with Marjorie's family, especially her brother Jimmy.
Haha, trips.
A full house.
They would play cards on the patio in the back and have their drinks and enjoy each other. They were always happy. They were soulmates.
He seemed like a very nice guy, very clean cut. Of course, you got to be pretty much clean cut in the military. They were just lovey-dovey the whole time. We just thought, hey, this is a match made in heaven, really, is what we could see from the outside.
My turn to excuse myself. Little girl's room.
They were very affectionate with each other. If she went to the bathroom, he would get up from the table, wait for her by the bathroom door, walk her back to the table, like he was escorting her, making sure that she was okay. The chivalry to the cute extreme.
Cute and also protective.
I think they had in common the fact that they had struggled in previous relationships.
What was that about?
Roger's goal is to be the opposite of Timothy.
Timothy, Marjorie's ex-boyfriend, was abusive.
How am I doing so far?
It's first see how good you are at poker.
Feel him up?
I don't know if it was one-sided or two-sided, but there was some domestic violence going on in that relationship.
Roger and Marjorie's courtship is fast and furious. but it's interrupted by long absences. She spends months overseas on missions, training to be an intelligence operative.
She would check out the other Army bases. I remember she got to go to Italy, to Korea too, and Germany.
But whenever she returns to Texas, it's into the arms of the ever-patient and attentive Roger. Less than a year after they meet, Marjorie and Roger elope.
And then all of a sudden, they were going out on a cruise to get married.
They didn't want a family wedding. She been there, done that.
I think they just enjoyed doing things that were spontaneous. This was away from the usual way of doing things, just like the red wedding dress.
When the newlyweds return to Texas, they briefly live with Marjorie's brother as they wait for their next assignment.
So, how much did that cruise set us back?
Just working that out now.
Now that they're married, Roger and Marjorie combine their finances.
I think she got to a trust with Roger to where she passed that off and trusted him to take care of the bills and do the bills.
Do you guys have a joint account already?
Accounts, actually.
I was told that they were all in Margie's name because she had the credit. And I don't know why he didn't have any credit.
It had to do with his ex-wife. He was not wanting his ex-wife to have access to anything that he had jointly with Margie.
Besides which, money is not tight.
When they would get cars or they would get the motorcycles, it was always in Margie's name.
They drove out to California. They drove to Arizona to visit Ron's mom and his sister and her husband and stayed a while with them. They had vacations. They had cruises. I can't say I blame any of them any. If I had extra money, I'd be traveling too.
They were both E7s, making a ton of money. They had no children at the time, so they had nobody else to spend their money on except for themselves.
But strangely, about a year after getting married, something doesn't add up.
Hey, Jimmy. I've got a favor to ask you. I was wondering if you could keep it quiet from your sis.
Roger came to me and he asked for $6,000 in a loan. And he said, don't tell Margie. I don't want her to know. I would get in trouble for asking you. He never told me what it was for. I didn't ask what it was for.
Hey, of course, man. Your family.
I gave him the loan because I trusted him. He was with my sister.
Psychotherapist Stacy Kaiser and forensic psychologist Brian Russell see cause for concern.
The fact that Roger is hiding a secret from Marjorie is a huge red flag. And the fact that he aligned with her brother to do it is even worse. I think the reason that he's doing it is because he's trying to protect her from the fact that he's been spending money. But that's not the kind of protection she needs, because without knowing that they're in a financial dilemma, she isn't able to help fix it.
Either Roger wants to buy something that he knows Marjorie would not be okay with. Secondly, he could be wanting to buy something for Marjorie that he knows Marjorie will be happy with. But if he has to borrow for it, then that suggests to me that the couple's finances can't really handle this purchase. It's deeply concerning to me because it suggests to me that there are things that Roger believes he can't or doesn't want to share with Marjorie.
Hey guys, what's going on?
We'll be right in.
Okay.
But when the truth comes out, there will be hell to pay.
Margie probably went a little bit crazy. She can go from 0 to 60.
Just as newlyweds Roger and Marjorie Holland settle into married life together, Roger secretly borrows $6,000 from his brother-in-law, Jimmy.
And I thought, you know, I would get repaid.
Before Roger has the chance to pay Jimmy back, he and Marjorie get amazing news.
Our first deployment as husband and wife. Djibouti!
Africa?
She was all for the deployment. She loved helping people. That was her goal.
Our task over in the Horn of Africa was to help train their military.
For Marge? Marge, you ready?
Yes.
The work is demanding and sometimes dangerous.
Here you go, Marge. All right, guys. 3, 2, 1, and go. All right, Marge.
She would get in there with the rest of the guys, and she was an excellent marksman. She did not have to be told what to do.
Oh, yes! She got you. Next time I'll be you, though. All right, guys, time to go.
While the risk level in Djibouti is high, so too is the potential for adventure.
We actually got the chance to go dive with the whale sharks. As far as a couple, they would be holding hands together while they were diving. That goes to say that no one knows what goes on behind closed doors.
With their grand adventure behind them, the couple set sail on another cruise and return with some exciting news.
She was pregnant after the cruise. They wanted to have kids. They wanted to have a family. And that was 100% the cruise was for making a baby.
I think they were both at an age where it's time to start our family. And we were excited for them. They talked about Mama Bear and Papa Bear, and this was going to be Baby Bear.
Even though she wanted to continue doing her schooling, she wanted children, and she was afraid she was going to get too old.
We have something for you.
The ultrasound they took, they gave us a picture.
Really?
And that was really neat. And so it was going to be a granddaughter.
We're calling her Olivia.
I think that was the highlight of their life at that point, was making sure that that's their focus every day.
It's now time to put the adventures on hold and create a real stable home, ideally close to family.
It was only about 15, 20 miles from where we lived, so it was easy access to be able to go see them.
It's a dream come true.
You see the refrigerator every day, and you zoom right in on that little baby that's growing, little Baby Bear.
They were making considerable preparations for the baby.
Check this out. This is the Harley of baby wheels.
Only the best for Baby Bear.
You like it?
Yeah. Look what I got. Ta-da!
You got great taste.
$20,000 or more for a baby that they literally just found out about.
They also load up on toys for themselves.
In Margie's name again, they got an Audi and a brand new Jeep.
There was guns laying out throughout the residence, which were very high-end, very nice, semi-automatic weapons. There was handguns, there was rifles, a good arsenal of weapons that they kept for themselves.
Marjorie gives up her military career to pursue medical school and motherhood, while Roger finds a high-paying private sector job.
The next best thing to breakfast in bed, homemade lunch.
Thanks, honey.
He was providing security around a nuclear power plant.
That's great, babe. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too?
He said that job brought in about $140,000 to $150,000 a year.
Hey, hon.
Yeah?
Did you get the mail today?
No. I guess it's late. But don't you be.
They had income from the severance from the military once they were discharged from the military.
To the outside world, this couple looked like a very successful, young, professional, or working couple. So they were living a life where they had seemingly plenty of money and no concerns with any of their finances, and were very successful.
But something doesn't sit right with Marjorie's brother Jimmy. It's been well over a year, and Roger still hasn't paid him back the $6,000.
I said, are you going to make a payment? Or are you going to send me some money? And he's like, next paycheck, next, I'll get to you, but never received a dime.
And as the weeks go by, it's not just Jimmy who's asking questions about money.
The finances for the couple was completely handled by Roger. But Marjorie had received some type of late payment notice directed specifically to her.
When I look at this dilemma that Marjorie is in, it occurs to me that she has done what I see a lot of spouses do in a marriage, which is they trust their partner completely with the finances. And so here she gets this past due notice and she discovers, wait a minute, things aren't getting paid. And she's enraged with him.
She strikes me as the kind of a woman who probably is going to not just sit back and see what happens, but is going to bring that up to Roger and have a come to Jesus with him about it. That's going to put Roger in a very defensive posture because he's going to be found out. He's going to be busted. And it'll be interesting to see whether he cops to it and sits down with her and agrees that they need to get a plan to get back to financial stability, or whether he denies, deflects, blames her.
Marjorie is pissed.
She did have a pretty good temper at times. If you really made her mad, she was hard to deal with at times when you did that.
The discovery prompted some arguments and some discussions.
And it's only the beginning.
It makes everything that they had seem like a charade. How much of it was actually true?
If you push her, then she's going to get really dramatic.
Is everything okay?
Marjorie Holland suspects her husband Roger is lying to her about their finances, and she wants to get to the bottom of it.
She was trying to piece together why suddenly this man that had told her that they were fine and that he had income coming in, they were in debt, and debt that she wasn't even aware that they had.
In the back of the Jeep, there was a satchel of mail.
It's weeks and weeks of letters and late notices.
A lot of their accounts were joint accounts that had both of their names on it. Margie saw overdraft notices and late payment notices that were directed to her on accounts that she didn't open or she wasn't aware of.
Her mail was kept from her. She didn't know any of that until she was putting things together.
What the hell is all this?
Okay, Marge, calm down. This is just a little debt, okay? I've paid most of these bills off, and I'm gonna pay the rest next week on my next check, okay? It's under control.
The response, it was, don't worry, I'll take care of it, honey. My mistake. I'll fix it right away. You'll see.
Why didn't you tell me?
Because I didn't want you to worry. Look, we've got the baby and everything. This is under control. I got this.
Are you sure?
Yes, it's good, honestly.
That was the one thing that I admired about Roger, was the fact that he, of all of the boyfriends or men that she had had in her life, seemed to be the one that could calm her down when she got to that point, well, reaching for that emergency, the red button.
It's gonna be fine.
She believed there was a plan. She believed that her husband was telling her the truth.
But days later, something still seems off.
I love you.
See you tonight.
So every day Roger would portray that he was going to work. He would get up, he would go off and go out.
Just hanging out at local restaurants and coffee houses.
He would be gone for X amount of hours and come back, and he would text during the day like he was at work. He would do everything like he had a job. But there was never a job.
Oh, I'm sure she probably just about went through the roof. And at that point, it would probably bring her temper out pretty good.
At best, Roger is behaving in an extremely cowardly way. At worst, he's making me worried about Marjorie because they're still spending money, but no money's coming in. So I'm worried as I wonder how Roger thinks this is going to end.
What Roger's done at this point is he's really trapped himself. Either Marjorie's going to find out or he's going to have to tell her. And one of the things we know about people who end up trapped in that way is they begin to panic and they begin to do things without thinking clearly. And so I'm worried about how things are going to escalate in this marriage.
With being lied to, with having your credit smeared to no end, with the person that you love so much that you married to go behind your back is deplorable.
So, you're a barista now.
Margie probably went a little bit crazy. If you push her, then she's gonna get really dramatic.
I saw you at the coffee shop.
March, the job fell through. I didn't want to let you down, okay?
Oh, it is way too late for that. You are going to make this right, or else!
The next few days are tense, and Marjorie's parents witness that tension firsthand.
You should probably fold.
Oh no, he's got nothing.
I'm going to call. Sorry, Sergeant. Full house.
I'm so bad at bluffing.
Sure you are.
Excuse me. March, what's going on? You're being obnoxious.
Yeah? Well, you're being a big liar.
They had an argument.
March.
And Ron and I were like, what's going on?
We're getting a divorce.
Her temper probably showed up, and he probably got really nervous at that point because he should be.
Get out. Now!
She's gonna get upset with you. She can go from 0 to 60.
Yeah, take a walk or something.
But Marjorie's temper is the least of this couple's problems.
There was something that told me that it wasn't a classic medical.
They are checking for vitals. They cannot find any vitals.
"14-week pregnant Marjorie Holland is furious with husband Roger for deceiving her, for lying about having a job and running the couple deep into debt, while Roger is scared of his wife's temper.
I don't understand.
What about the baby? Raising a child alone? Just think about it, okay?
There was a series of text messages where she led him probably to believe that she was going to give him a chance to fix it. And she talked about how, okay, we'll see what you can do. Eventually, it all went back to her disbelief that he could get her to this point.
When I think about the magnitude of the deceit that has happened to Marjorie, I really have to wonder who's going to be the first to explode. Roger realizing that the clock is ticking and that this facade cannot be maintained indefinitely, it's totally unsustainable, or Marjorie because she knows now how badly he has betrayed her trust.
The hopeful side of me says that Roger and Marjorie could possibly come together. Roger could step up, behave like he's supposed to, do what he's supposed to. But the truth is that when I look at Roger and I see what a mess he has made of everything and how many lies have been told and how much betrayal has been involved, I find it hard to believe that he would be able to pull that off.
Ma, I think I'm coming to stay.
Marjorie has had it. She's ready to leave Roger, but he manages to find a solution. just in the nick of time.
I gotta go, Mom. Marge, I got some news. It's good news, okay? I got a job offer.
Yeah.
Listen, it's in Texas, near Jimmy. It's a great job. Okay, you gotta trust me on this one, okay? Please?
He had made some contacts through his work in the service while he was in the military, that he had used those contacts in order to obtain this security job for a corporation in Texas.
We're gonna get through this. Okay, trust me. Okay.
They were going to move back here together, and they had me looking for houses down here.
Roger and Marjorie will never see that house.
Victim is unconscious at the bottom of the stairs.
When the dispatcher put it out, there was something in the dispatcher's voice that told me this call was different and that it wasn't a classic medical. Something didn't sound right. There were officers already working to try and revive Marjorie.
She is unresponsive. She is not moving. They are checking for vitals. They cannot find any vitals, and they are continuing CPR efforts.
We worked fairly quickly to move Roger away from Margie's body because he didn't need to see the life-saving efforts that were going on.
As paramedics rush Marjorie to the hospital, police look to Roger for information.
Just start at the beginning.
Okay. She was really hungry this morning, okay? She was starved, so I went out to get her some food.
I want a burrito. A big one.
Burrito? What are we having, triplets?
Oh, hearty har.
All right, I'll get you that.
Get out of here.
While he was gone, he texted with her.
She had sent him off to a restaurant that wasn't open for breakfast. So she texted saying switch it to another fast food restaurant for breakfast. And so he rerouted himself, picked up the food that she wanted, and came back to the house.
Then I get home, and I saw her. She's at the bottom of the stairs. Hey, Marge, got the food. Marge?
His explanation was she had tripped and fallen down the stairs.
It looks like a tragic accident, and Roger's breakfast story checks out.
He had receipts that showed us he had actually purchased food. He had a bag of food and some drinks at the location that were now spilled around where she was found, which looks exactly correct. He had shown me his cell phone in order to prove that he was out of the house and that he was texting with her. I said to him that this timeline that you're providing with these text messages is very important.
Could I hold on to this?
No problem.
It is legal for me to seize that phone because it's movable property that's easily damaged, destroyed, or altered.
Roger heads to the hospital, where family members begin to gather.
And when I got into the hospital, I walked past where Margie was. I could see her laying there. But my wife wouldn't let me go into that room.
Marjorie is pronounced dead, along with the baby.
Roughly 10:30, I got the phone call from my dad saying, your sister's dead. You need to get to Minnesota immediately. I dropped the phone and was in shock.
I was walking down the hallway with Roger to the room and holding his hand and telling the police officers don't let him go home because there's guns all over the place.
Thank you.
My concerns for him was I just thought mentally he was going to be able to handle this because Margie was his strength, just like he was hers. At that point, Roger holds out his hand and he says Olivia was only this big.
Everybody at that point was saying pregnancy death, and that's what we all assumed.
Meanwhile, the investigation into the accident continues. Police look at Roger's movements.
There's corroboration for his initial statement to law enforcement officers that yes, he was there, yes, he in fact left, went to a fast food restaurant, and then returned within about 30 minutes.
Security footage shows Roger leaving the building at 9:34 a.m. and returning at 9:53. Roger is brought to the police station for his official deposition. Police note something unusual.
I just noticed that you have some scratches on your left side of the face.
His statement as to the scratches on his neck are that Marjorie had done that. Earlier in the day, she was sitting in front of him and she was having some cramping with her pregnancy.
I rolled over, tried to rub her stomach. That way she could play with my head and stuff.
Just breathe, it's gonna be okay.
Her legs went straight and she just burrowed down with her fingernails.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay.
These cramps are unbearable.
I said ow and she started to say sorry.
Police photograph Roger's scratches. He then leaves to spend the night at Ron and Barbara's house.
We just brought him home and we sat around the dining room table and tried to console him through this. He constantly had his head down. This was his way of going through shock and dealing with it. He just said,
I don't know what I'm gonna do.
Then the next day, a routine autopsy is performed, and what they discover is shocking.
The medical examiner said there was a break in the horn of the thyroid cartilage. And we said, could that ever happen by someone falling down the stairs? He said, absolutely not.
The autopsy showed that there were no natural causes of death, and that it was likely by homicide.
Now it's a murder investigation. But the only person home with Marjorie that morning has an alibi.
We began to look at potential suspects in the case.
She fought back. She's a fighter.
Roger Holland discovers his wife Marjorie, 15 weeks pregnant, dead at the bottom of the stairs. Police learn she died not from the fall, but from strangulation.
Obviously, then we began to look at potential suspects in the case. We did receive some reports of a boyfriend that she had a tumultuous relationship with in the past. However, he was contacted and law enforcement was able to alibi him. In other words, put him at a different time and place at the time of her death. And obviously the person they began to look at was Roger.
The police revisit his story, including the security footage.
So the timeline that he gave us were that he left approximately half an hour.
Roger told police that during that time, he was texting Marjorie about breakfast.
The video indicated that he did not leave the garage residence till 9:34. The text went out at 9:29, which would indicate that he was probably in the building, if not in the residence itself, at the time the text was sent.
When police review the couple's financial records, what they find is alarming.
In the end, we found out that they were $166,000 in debt, mostly credit cards and vehicle leases.
Roger was responsible for nearly all of it.
It was all built on borrowed money and fake bank accounts and bleeding out their severance pay. The presumed motive in the case was that he had essentially built a house of cards.
Aside from the debts, authorities later learn Roger might have had another reason for wanting her dead, a life insurance policy she took out in Africa.
This is an insurance policy that is common for soldiers that are being deployed overseas. I believe it was $100,000, and obviously he would have been the beneficiary of that insurance policy upon her death.
And then the police make two more startling discoveries. The morning of the murder, Marjorie was looking for any way out possible.
The search on her phone was, how late in a pregnancy can I get an abortion? We were already clear in that house as to how much this baby meant to both of them. So for her to say that, or her to consider that, whether it was known to him or not, is pretty telling of kind of a crisis point in their relationship.
She was traumatized. She was revolted to possibly be carrying a child from a man like that had deceived her so. I don't know if she would have ever carried that out or not. I don't know.
But the clincher is found on Roger's home computer.
They did a history search.
Can you break your neck falling down the stairs? In his mind, he may have thought, this is the perfect way to kill her, and if I stage her at the bottom of the stairs, they'll believe me.
Not only is Roger a suspect, they believe the murder did not happen in the heat of the moment.
He had planned and premeditated her murder.
Roger is interrogated once more, but does not confess.
I can't explain why stuff's not making sense, but I did not do this to my wife. Did not hurt her. Didn't do this.
It doesn't matter.
You're under arrest for the murder of your wife.
The entire story played out in Roger and Marjorie's text messages in the days leading up to the murder.
They had planned to move to Texas, and that was all in the works. She believed it was going to happen within weeks.
But somehow, Marjorie discovers the job in Texas is a fake.
What do you mean we can't get a loan?
They had placed a $10,000 deposit on a residence, and something fell through, likely with the finances and not being able to qualify for the full loan.
She's now realized that he has accessed some of her military severance pay, that he has forged her signature, opened a credit card using her name, which could obviously involve some criminal ramifications.
Roger, get in here!
Police believe Roger decided there was only one way for him to escape debt and jail time for fraud.
The bank just called.
I told you I would fix this.
Yeah, right. I'll fix you. I'm gonna call the cops.
No, you're not.
He decided today's the day I'm gonna kill her.
The whole world is gonna know who you really are.
It was absolutely a fight. She was fit, she was strong, she was no frail woman. Somewhere between the bedroom upstairs and the floor at the bottom of the stairs, he had to have put his hand around her throat and squeezed her throat until she stopped breathing and the cartilage in her neck was broken. He spent the next half an hour to 2 hours putting together and staging his plan.
I went out to get food
to convince us that she had died accidentally.
She broke her neck.
He placed a comforter there so that perhaps she tripped over the comforter, tumbled down the stairs. He then accessed her phone, which he had access to the passcode. He set up the text messages, get the breakfast. He would come back and then place the 911 call.
Only 2 days into the investigation, Roger Holland is charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, one for Marjorie and one for the unborn Olivia. On December 16, 2013, he is convicted of both murders and sentenced to 2 life terms.
I asked for consecutive sentences for the significance of the termination of my would-have-been-born grandchild.
We actually keep that picture on the wall at home, too, because she's still a part of her life.
It doesn't get any more sociopathic than killing your own child, let alone your spouse. And so Roger is really a frightening example of the extent to which narcissism can reach, where somebody is so totally entitled in their own mind to have whatever it is that they want, that they are willing to eliminate anybody and everybody in their way, including their own offspring.
He didn't have an emotional connection to that unborn baby. He didn't have an emotional connection to his wife. And so for him, they were collateral damage, and it was time for them to go. Now, one of the things that we know about narcissists is they tend to overestimate their talents and skills. And I believe that's exactly what Roger did here. He concocts a plan, and law enforcement is going to think it was an accident, and he's going to get off scot-free.
He conned everybody, and he was good at it. I would have laid down my life for him without hesitation. But for him to do what he did and have this charade go on, that's just unspeakable. He took away an angel on earth.
Margie gave me a book, Mothers and Daughters, and underlined, and it's my treasure, things that she felt between us and for all mothers and for women. It's just really sad that she was taken for granted and advantage of.
This happens to other people's families. It doesn't happen to us. It hurt 5 years ago, and it hurts now, just like it was yesterday.
Well, with losing Margie, you know, it's hard because you're not going to be able to spend time with her anymore. Losing Olivia is that we never really got to meet her, never got to see her, and never got to raise her and enjoy the time with her and share the world. It's rough.
The Pacific Ocean is often described by those who sail it as an endless mirror of deep, unforgiving blue, a vast expanse where the horizon blurs the line between the water and the sky. In the heart of this vastness lies American Samoa, a collection of islands that seem, at first glance, to be the very definition of a tropical sanctuary. It is a place of jagged emerald peaks, white sands, and the constant, rhythmic lullaby of the tide hitting the reef. For the United States, it is a strategic outpost. For the locals, it is a sacred ancestral home governed by the ancient codes of Samoa. But in the late 1990s, this paradise became the backdrop for a nightmare that the modern world likes to pretend no longer exists. It is a story not of a lone predator or a shadowy serial killer, but of a calculated, industrial-scale cruelty that thrived under the American flag. The horror did not take place in a dark alley or a hidden basement, but inside a massive, corrugated metal structure known as the Dewusa factory. To the outside world, it was merely a garment plant producing clothing for major American brands. To the hundreds of souls trapped inside, it was a labor camp, a fortress of starvation, and ultimately a theater of horrific violence. The air in Tago Pago is usually thick with the scent of salt and tropical blooms, but for the workers arriving from the rural villages of Vietnam and the industrial provinces of China, the air smelled only of sweat and desperation. They had been lured there by a promise that felt like a lifeline. In the late 90s, recruitment agencies in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City were buzzing with the news of a South Korean businessman named Kil Soo Lee. He was offering a chance at the American dream, but with a twist. You didn't have to go to the mainland. You could go to American Samoa, work in a modern factory, earn American dollars, and return home a hero to your family. The price for this ticket to a better life was steep, often requiring families to mortgage their ancestral lands or borrow from predatory lenders to pay recruitment fees that reached upwards of $8,000. It was a gamble, but for these women, it was a gamble worth taking. They imagined clean dormitories, fair wages, and the protection of American law. They believed that because the factory was on American soil, they would be safe. They had no way of knowing that they were being sold into a system of neo-slavery curated by a man who viewed human beings as nothing more than disposable components in a profit-making machine. By the time the sun rose over the harbor on November 28, 2000, the illusion of paradise had long since evaporated for the workers of Dewusa. The lush green mountains surrounding the factory had become the walls of a natural prison. For months, the situation inside the plant had been deteriorating. The promised wages had never materialized, Or if they did, they were docked for room and board until almost nothing remained. Hunger had become a permanent resident in the barracks. The women were being fed little more than boiled cabbage and rice, sometimes only once a day, while being forced to work 18-hour shifts under the blistering heat of the metal roof. Tensions had reached a breaking point. Small acts of defiance had begun to surface, hushed conversations in the sewing lines, refused meals, and eventually, a desperate strike. Kilsali, a man whose temperament was as volatile as the tropical storms that lashed the island, decided that the time for coercion had passed. He wanted to send a message that would resonate through the bones of every worker in his employ. He didn't call the police. He didn't call for mediators. Instead, he summoned his enforcers. What followed was a coordinated assault that shattered the silence of the industrial park. As the workers gathered in the cafeteria, hoping for a resolution or perhaps just a morsel of food, they were met not with words, but with a phalanx of men armed with the tools of their trade turned into instruments of terror. These were not strangers. Some were the very managers who had overseen their work, men like Quyen Trong, who had swapped their clipboards for lead pipes and wooden bats. The violence was sudden, chaotic, and sickeningly intimate. In the confined space of the cafeteria, there was nowhere to run. The sound of nettles striking bone echoed against the tin walls, punctuated by the screams of women who realized, in that terrible moment, that the law they thought would protect them was thousands of miles away. It was a massacre of the spirit as much as the body. This was the day the American dream in Samoa bled out on a dirty linoleum floor, leaving behind a trail of broken limbs and a permanent darkness in the eyes of those who survived. To understand how a South Korean national could turn a piece of American territory into a private fiefdom of torture, one must look at the man at the center of the web. Kilsali was not a man of mystery. He was a man of ambition who understood the loopholes of international trade. He knew that by setting up shop in American Samoa, he could slap a Made in USA label on his products while operating with the oversight of a third-world sweatshop. He was a master of manipulation, playing local officials against federal regulations and ensuring that his workers remained isolated from the local Samoan community. He cultivated an environment of total dependency. From the moment the workers touched down at Pago Pago International Airport, their autonomy was stripped away. Their passports were seized, a classic hallmark of human trafficking, and they were transported directly to the compound. They were told that if they left the grounds, they would be arrested by the local police, whom he claimed were in his pocket. Isolated by language, by geography, and by fear, they were the perfect victims. The cruelty of the Dewusa plan was not just in the physical blows dealt on that November morning, but in the slow, agonizing erosion of human dignity that preceded it. The barracks were a far cry from the modern housing promised in the glossy recruitment brochures. Instead, hundreds of women were packed into rooms with rows of bunk beds stacked to the ceiling. The plumbing was often non-existent, and the heat was suffocating. There was no privacy, no safety, and very little hope. When women complained of illness or exhaustion, they were met with threats of deportation, a terrifying prospect for those who had mortgaged their family's entire future to get there. To return home empty-handed and in debt was, for many, a fate worse than death. Lee knew this. He used their love for their families as a weapon against them, turning their work ethic into a shackle. He was a chick and a slave master in every sense of the word, operating in the modern era under the guise of global commerce. As we peel back the layers of this case, we find a story that challenges our perception of justice. It is a story that requires us to look at the tags on our clothing and ask what they truly cost. The Dewusa case is a grim reminder that the most horrific crimes are often those committed in broad daylight under the signature of contracts and the hum of sewing machines. The victims were not just the women who were beaten that day. They were the hundreds who endured the daily grind of starvation and fear, waiting for a rescue that felt like it would never come. As the investigation eventually unfolded, it would reveal a level of depravity that shocked even seasoned FBI agents, men who had seen the worst of humanity but were unprepared for the clinical, calculated nature of Kilsali's empire. This is the chronicle of the Dewusa Samoa massacre, a journey from the heights of hope to the depths of a Pacific hell, and the grueling fight to reclaim justice from a man who thought he was untouchable. To comprehend the gravity of the nightmare that unfolded within the confines of the Dewusa facility, one must first look far beyond the shores of American Samoa. The story begins thousands of miles away, deeply rooted in the bustling cities and quiet rural provinces of Vietnam and China. The victims in this tragedy were not random targets selected by chance. They were carefully chosen based on their immense vulnerability and their overwhelming desire to provide a better life for their families. These were primarily young women, daughters, and mothers who carried the heavy burden of familial duty, living in economies where opportunities for substantial financial advancement were painfully scarce. For many of these women, daily life was a constant struggle against the tide of poverty. They worked in local garment factories or agricultural fields, earning meager wages that barely covered the barest necessities of survival, let alone the means to build a secure future. When recruiters began circulating through their tight-knit communities, offering formal contracts to work in a garment factory on United States territory, it must have felt less like a simple job offer and more like a miraculous deliverance from a life of hardship. The recruiters painted a vivid, intoxicating picture of prosperity, promising high incomes that could rapidly transform the destinies of entire families. This was the powerful allure of the American economy, a beacon of hope that convinced these women to leave everything they knew and loved behind. Accepting this extraordinary opportunity, however, required an immense leap of faith and a crippling initial sacrifice. Securing a coveted position at the Dewusa factory was not simply a matter of signing a piece of paper and packing a bag. It demanded the payment of exorbitant recruitment fees. These fees represented astronomical sums for the workers, amounts that could take a lifetime of harsh labor to save under their current circumstances. To gather the necessary funds, entire families were forced to pool their life savings, borrow heavily from relatives, or, in the most desperate cases, take out high-interest loans from local moneylenders, using their modest family homes or small plots of ancestral land as collateral. This crushing financial prerequisite was the first subtle turn of the lock in a meticulously designed trap. Before the women even boarded a plane to leave their homeland, they were already burdened by a massive, looming debt. They were essentially trading their future financial freedom for the mere promise of wealth, unaware that this very debt would soon become the strongest chain used to bind them to their captors. The psychological weight of this massive financial obligation cannot be overstated. It meant that returning home prematurely or returning empty-handed was an absolute impossibility. Failure would mean the total financial ruin of their entire extended family, a profound shame and a burden too devastating to even contemplate. The journey to American Samoa was long and disorienting, a grueling transit across the vast, seemingly endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean. As the airplanes carried them further and further away from the familiar landscapes and languages of Asia, the sheer geographical isolation of their ultimate destination began to materialize. For many of these young women, it was their very first time traveling outside their home countries, their first time stepping onto an airplane. The soaring anticipation surely mixed with a profound, quiet sense of anxiety. They were traveling to a place they knew absolutely nothing about, entirely dependent on the promises made by strangers holding their contracts. When the aircraft finally descended toward the lush, volcanic peaks of Tutuila Island, the visual contrast must have been breathtaking. From the sky, American Samoa looks like a pristine emerald dropped carelessly into an endless sapphire sea. It is a place of breathtaking natural beauty, wrapped in the warm, humid embrace of the tropics. But this profound isolation, the very characteristic that makes the island so picturesque and tranquil, was also the key structural component of the trap awaiting them. They were landing on a tiny speck of land surrounded by thousands of miles of deep, unforgiving ocean, far removed from the protective structures, advocacy groups, and social safety nets they might have found had they landed on the American mainland. The fragile illusion of a promising new beginning was shattered almost immediately upon their arrival at the island's small airport. The transition from hopeful, traveling workers to captive, indentured laborers happened with terrifying speed, orchestrated with the cold, practiced efficiency of an industrial assembly line. As the women stepped off the plane, exhausted and deeply disoriented by the heavy tropical climate and the arduous journey, they were met by stern representatives of the WhoDidIMarry management team. Instead of a welcoming orientation session or a briefing on their new high-paying jobs, they were subjected to a swift and systematic stripping of their personal autonomy. The managers immediately and aggressively demanded that the workers hand over their passports and any accompanying travel documents. This single, calculated act was the definitive moment the trap snapped completely shut. A passport in a foreign land is not merely a booklet of stamped paper. It is a person's core identity, their legal standing, and their only conceivable means of escape. By confiscating these crucial documents, the management effectively erased the workers' legal existence outside the physical confines of the factory. The women were now undocumented aliens trapped on a remote island, entirely at the mercy of their new employer. Without their passports, they could not board a commercial flight home, they could not seek legitimate employment elsewhere on the island, and they were utterly terrified of approaching local law enforcement authorities for fear of immediate arrest and forced deportation. With their identities securely locked away in the management's office safes, the terrified workers were loaded into vehicles and transported directly to the WhoDidIMarry compound. As they approached the sprawling facility, the jarring reality of their new life began to fully set in. The factory did not resemble the modern, safe, and clean working environment they had been promised in the glossy recruitment materials. Instead, it was a sprawling, grim industrial complex, its massive corrugated metal walls baking relentlessly under the intense tropical sun. It looked far less like a place of employment and much more like a fortified, inescapable encampment. The physical structure of the factory served as a constant, looming reminder of their profound isolation. High, imposing fences and heavily guarded gates separated the industrial complex from the surrounding local community, ensuring that the workers remained completely invisible to the outside world. This deliberate segregation prevented the women from interacting with the local Samoan population, learning about their basic human rights under territorial law, or seeking any form of external help or sanctuary. They were completely cut off from any potential source of support, existing entirely within a closed ecosystem completely controlled by the factory owner, Kilsali, and his network of subordinate managers. The sheer physical footprint of the factory, vast and utterly unwelcoming, became a daily monument to their entrapment. The living conditions waiting for them within the compound were a stark, horrifying manifestation of the management's complete and utter disregard for human life, comfort, and basic dignity. The women were aggressively herded into squalid, dilapidated barracks that defied any acceptable standard of basic human habitation. These dormitories were severely overcrowded, with endless rows of crude, uncomfortable bunk beds crammed tightly into dark, poorly ventilated rooms. The intense tropical heat, amplified by the uninsulated metal roofs of the buildings, turned the sleeping quarters into suffocating, inescapable ovens. There was absolutely no respite from the sweltering temperatures day or night, and the stagnant air was perpetually thick with the smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, and mounting desperation. Basic hygiene was an absolute impossibility. The plumbing facilities were woefully inadequate for the hundreds of desperate people housed there, frequently broken, continuously overflowing, and creating unsanitary, humiliating conditions that stripped the women of their privacy. The workers were forced to live in a state of constant, grinding degradation, stripped of their humanity. The accumulating filth and the severe overcrowding created an environment incredibly ripe for the rapid spread of disease, adding agonizing physical illness to the rapidly mounting list of their daily sufferings. These were not living quarters by any modern definition. They were holding pens specifically designed to house human machinery as cheaply and callously as possible. The profound physical discomfort and humiliation of their living situation was soon entirely eclipsed by a much deeper, more terrifying anxiety, the dawning realization that the central, guiding promise of their entire journey was a complete fabrication. The high, transformative income they had traveled thousands of miles across the ocean to earn simply did not exist. As the grueling days turned into weeks and the exhausting weeks stretched into months, the workers endured relentless, back-breaking shifts on the factory sewing lines, pushing their weakened bodies to the absolute point of physical collapse to meet impossible daily production quotas. Yet, when the promised payday finally arrived, their bruised hands remained completely empty. The management employed a wide variety of deceitful, manipulative tactics to justify illegally withholding their hard-earned wages. They claimed falsely that the money was being held securely in trust accounts, or they levied exorbitant, completely fabricated deductions for the miserable, inadequate room and board they were barely providing. Sometimes the overseers offered no explanation whatsoever, relying purely on physical intimidation and the workers' absolute powerlessness to brutally silence any timid demands for rightful payment. This systematic, calculated theft of wages was not merely a tragic administrative failure. It was a deliberate, malicious strategy of total control. By keeping the workers entirely destitute and dependent, the management ensured they remained eternally desperate and forcibly compliant. The complete absence of wages triggered an agonizing, slow-burning psychological crisis for the captive women. Every single day they labored without pay was another day they felt they were failing the vulnerable families they had left behind. They knew with absolute certainty that back in their distant home villages, the massive loans they had taken out to secure these specific jobs were rapidly accumulating crushing interest. They could vividly imagine the growing panic and despair of their aging parents or young children as the promised, life-saving remittances consistently failed to arrive. This constant, gnawing anxiety about the impending financial ruin of their deeply loved ones was a heavy, suffocating chain that the factory management continuously and sadistically tightened. The workers were trapped in a horrifying, inescapable paradox. They simply could not afford to stay and slowly work themselves to death for absolutely nothing. But they absolutely could not afford to flee without the crucial money they so desperately needed to repay their mountainous debts. Their profound love for their families, their deep-seated sense of familial responsibility, had been masterfully and cruelly weaponized against them. This relentless debt bondage completely broke their spirit, slowly turning independent, hopeful women into terrified, submissive captives who felt they had absolutely no choice but to silently endure whatever horrific abuses were routinely inflicted upon them, clinging to the desperate, fading hope that eventually, miraculously, they might be paid. As if the blatant theft of their wages and the unimaginable squalor of their surroundings were not enough to break them, the factory management deployed an even more primal, devastating form of physical subjugation, deliberate, systemic starvation. Food, the most basic and undeniable human necessity, was tightly controlled, severely rationed, and weaponized to maintain total, unquestioned dominance over the workforce. The meager meals provided to the exhausting workers were not only severely nutritionally deficient but shockingly, dangerously small in quantity. The women were systematically underfed, forced to endure incredibly long, physically demanding manual labor while subsisting on cruel, near-starvation rations. The daily, monotonous sustenance often consisted of absolutely nothing more than a thin, watery broth, incredibly small portions of plain, unseasoned rice, and perhaps a few meager scraps of overboiled cabbage. This severe, ongoing caloric deficit had a rapid and entirely predictable devastating impact on their physical health and stamina. Once strong, capable, and vibrant women became terribly weak, visibly emaciated, and frequently prone to fainting directly on the hard concrete of the factory floor. The constant, gnawing ache of profound hunger slowly eroded their physical stamina and clouded their minds, making it increasingly difficult to resist the harsh, constant demands of their cruel overseers. Starvation is a brutally effective, ancient tool for breaking human resistance, a physical body that is desperately, entirely fighting for its very next calorie has precious little energy left for organizing any form of meaningful rebellion. The environment inside the enclosed Dewusa factory was a meticulously constructed, flawlessly executed ecosystem of absolute, suffocating despair. Every single aspect of the workers' daily lives, from their precarious legal status to their physical nourishment, was completely, unyieldingly controlled by a management structure that viewed them as utterly expendable commodities rather than breathing human beings. The stark, mocking contrast between the vibrant, sun-drenched paradise of the tropical island outside the heavy steel gates and the dark, suffocating, industrial reality inside the factory walls only served to greatly deepen their daily psychological torment. They could clearly hear the gentle sounds of the island, the ocean whine moving through the lush tropical foliage, yet they were completely, entirely severed from that beautiful world. They were effectively buried alive in plain sight, their silent, desperate pleas for immediate intervention completely muffled by the constant roar of heavy industrial machinery and the vast, isolating expanse of the surrounding Pacific Ocean. The women had bravely journeyed across the world seeking the promise of the American dream, a powerful concept synonymous globally with freedom, boundless economic opportunity, and the strict, unyielding protection of law. Instead, they had stumbled blindly into a modern-day, horrific labor camp, a dark abyss where their fundamental human rights were systematically dismantled piece by piece. As the year 2000 slowly drew to a close, the mounting tension within the starving, exhausted, and hopelessly unpaid workforce reached an unbearable, highly critical threshold. The quiet, desperate endurance that had agonizingly characterized their early months of brutal captivity was beginning to severely fracture under the immense, unending pressure, slowly setting the stage for the explosive, horrific, and deeply tragic violence that would very soon permanently stain the factory floors. The human body can only endure a finite amount of severe deprivation before the primal instinct for survival completely overrides the paralyzing, suffocating grip of extreme fear. By the final, agonizing weeks of November in the year 2000, the atmosphere inside the enclosed Dewusa factory compound had transitioned from a state of grim, silent endurance into a tightly coiled spring of absolute, undeniable desperation. The women trapped within those massive, unyielding corrugated metal walls had been systematically and intentionally starved. Their daily nutritional rations reduced to an agonizingly inadequate minimum that left them chronically weak, constantly dizzy, and visibly physically deteriorating. The grand, intoxicating promises of steady, high wages that had initially lured them across the vast ocean from their impoverished, rural homes in Vietnam and China had rapidly proven to be nothing more than a cruel, highly calculated mirage, leaving them securely trapped in an inescapable cycle of relentless, exhausting, and completely unpaid physical labor. It was not merely the profound, bone-deep physical exhaustion that slowly pushed them toward an inevitable breaking point, but the agonizing, unrelenting psychological torture of knowing with absolute certainty that they were financially failing the deeply vulnerable families who entirely depended on their success back home. The crushing, inescapable weight of their mounting, astronomical recruitment debts hung over them constantly like a heavy, suffocating physical shadow. They slowly realized with horrifying, crystal-clear clarity that continued, silent compliance would absolutely not save them, that working even harder would never result in the promised paycheck. And that quiet, unquestioning obedience was simply a much slower, equally guaranteed method of dying on a foreign island. This collective, terrifying realization finally sparked a desperate, incredibly dangerous quiet organizing among the severely malnourished, exhausted workforce, ultimately leading to a unified, deeply risky decision to completely halt all industrial production. They initiated a sudden labor strike, a profoundly dangerous and highly volatile act of outright defiance in an isolated environment entirely controlled by a ruthless man who viewed them not as breathing human beings, but purely as expendable, easily replaceable mechanical components in his highly profitable garment empire. The morning of November 28th began with an eerie, deeply unsettling stillness that stood in massive, stark contrast to the usual, deafening, continuous roar of hundreds of heavy industrial sewing machines. The desperate workers, driven purely by the absolute, undeniable necessity of their dire, life-threatening circumstances, gathered together tentatively in the large, barren factory cafeteria. This uninviting space, normally a bleak, depressing sight where they quickly consumed their meager, watery, and nutritionally devoid daily rations, suddenly became the highly charged staging ground for their desperate, collective plea for basic, fundamental human rights and immediate survival. They absolutely did not gather with the intent of initiating physical violence. They gathered solely with the exhausted, incredibly fragile hope that a unified, peaceful collective halt to their manual labor would finally, inevitably force the wealthy factory owner to acknowledge their desperate humanity and immediately release their severely overdue, rightfully earned wages. The oppressive, heavy tropical heat was already building rapidly within the massive, unventilated metal structure, pressing down heavily on the deeply anxious, tightly packed crowd of vulnerable women. The stagnant air inside the large room was incredibly thick with a palpable, almost suffocating tension, a volatile, dangerous mixture of profound, deeply ingrained fear and the fragile, desperate courage born entirely of having absolutely nothing left in the world to lose. They stood closely together, a highly vulnerable collective of deeply exhausted, starving laborers waiting anxiously for a basic, reasonable labor negotiation that would tragically never come to pass. They fully expected administrative resistance, perhaps aggressive verbal threats or harsh, immediate disciplinary retaliation, but they were entirely, completely unprepared for the highly calculated, deeply vicious, military-style escalation of extreme physical brutality that had been meticulously and coldly planned in secret by the factory's absolute owner. Kilsuli, operating his remote, isolated business empire with the cold, detached, and absolute authority of a ruthless warlord commanding a completely captive territory, interpreted the workers' desperate, peaceful labor strike not as a standard, resolvable labor dispute, but as a direct, completely unacceptable challenge to his absolute, unyielding dominion over the facility. He had carefully and deliberately built his entire illicit, highly profitable enterprise on the foundational, unwavering principle of total, unquestioned control maintained through intense, constant psychological and physical subjugation of a highly vulnerable population. To sit down and peacefully negotiate with his trapped captives would, in his highly distorted, tyrannical mind, instantly validate their basic humanity, legitimize their legitimate grievances, and permanently fracture the carefully constructed, deeply terrifying illusion of his absolute, supreme power over their lives. Instead of engaging in any form of reasonable, productive dialogue, he consciously and deliberately chose the dark, horrific path of extreme, exemplary physical violence designed specifically to completely, permanently break the collective spirit of the entire workforce and instantly instill a level of terror so profound that the mere thought of any future, organized resistance would be entirely, absolutely eradicated. To aggressively execute this grim, deeply violent directive, he did not rely solely on hiring external, unknown security forces. He brilliantly and maliciously weaponized the very internal hierarchy of the factory floor itself. He immediately summoned his higher-level managerial staff, deliberately including several specific Vietnamese supervisors who shared the exact same cultural background, home country, and language as the vast majority of the desperate victims, and merged them seamlessly with a rough group of specially hired, highly aggressive local security enforcers. This highly calculated, deeply sinister mobilization of fellow countrymen aggressively turning against their own highly vulnerable, starving workers added a deeply sickening, profoundly devastating layer of psychological betrayal to the rapidly impending, massive physical assault. Lee issued a clear, cold, and entirely unequivocal violent mandate to his newly formed group of enforcers. They were to aggressively and completely crush the peaceful strike using absolutely whatever degree of extreme physical force was deemed necessary to terrify the women and force them immediately back onto the heavy production lines. The group of designated enforcers prepared eagerly for the impending physical confrontation, not as standard, professional managers politely addressing a dissatisfied workforce, but rather as an armed, aggressive militia preparing violently to suppress a dangerous, violent riot. They did not calmly carry administrative clipboards or official disciplinary write-ups in their hands. Instead, They aggressively scavenged the entire surrounding heavy industrial environment specifically for hard, dense items that could be easily utilized as highly effective instruments of severe, blunt force physical trauma against human bodies. Heavy, solid, thick iron plumbing pipes were deliberately selected for their terrifying, bone-breaking density and immense weight. Thick, heavy wooden bats and long, solid sticks were eagerly gathered specifically to deliver wide, sweeping, incredibly concussive blows to multiple targets simultaneously. Even more terrifyingly, various sharp, specialized, heavy metal tools used routinely in the daily, normal operations of the garment factory were gripped tightly and menacingly in the sweaty hands of the aggressively advancing managers and guards. Armed heavily with this improvised but highly lethal, deeply terrifying arsenal of blunt and sharp weapons, the large contingent of ruthless supervisors and guards descended rapidly upon the stifling, crowded, heavily populated cafeteria where the striking, anxious women were nervously holding their ground. The sudden, incredibly aggressive, and loud entry of the heavily armed group instantly and permanently shattered the fragile, incredibly anxious quiet of the large, tense room. The sheer, overwhelming visual impact of suddenly seeing their own daily supervisors angrily gripping heavy, solid iron pipes and crude, deadly weapons sent a massive, instantaneous shockwave of deep, primal panic ripping violently through the tightly gathered crowd of vulnerable women. The space, already cramped, incredibly hot, and deeply oppressive, suddenly and terrifyingly transformed into a sealed, completely inescapable death trap with the only functional exit heavily and completely blocked by the aggressively advancing, entirely unyielding line of highly aggressive, heavily armed men. The horrific eruption of extreme, unrestrained physical violence was completely instantaneous and entirely devoid of any preliminary, formal warning or any basic attempt at peaceful, verbal dispersal of the crowd. The aggressive enforcers charged directly and violently into the densely packed, terrified crowd of physically weakened, practically starving women, swinging their heavy, solid iron pipes and thick wooden bats with a completely unrestrained, deeply terrifying, and entirely merciless ferocity. The stagnant, hot air was instantly and permanently filled with the horrifying, deeply sickening sounds of solid, heavy metal striking directly against fragile, unprotected human bone, accompanied immediately by the piercing, agonizing, ear-splitting screams of sudden, severe, and massive physical trauma. The crowded cafeteria rapidly and violently devolved into a highly chaotic, heavily blood-soaked scene of absolute and mitigated human carnage. The terrified workers, possessing absolutely no defensive weapons of any kind and completely weakened physically by many long months of systematic, intentional starvation, had absolutely no conceivable means of defending themselves against the sudden, overwhelming, and highly vicious physical onslaught. They attempted desperately to flee in pure terror, scrambling wildly and desperately over heavy tables and chairs, pushing frantically against the solid, unyielding corrugated metal walls of the enclosed room, but the sheer, overwhelming density of the panicked crowd and the relentless ferocity of the armed attackers made any successful escape entirely impossible. The armed enforcers moved quickly through the panicked, screaming mass of women with a highly systematic, deeply brutal efficiency, striking blindly and repeatedly at unprotected heads, fragile arms, and soft torsos, clearly intent on inflicting the absolute maximum amount of physical damage possible to completely and permanently shatter any remaining collective resolve. Amidst this terrifying, wildly swirling chaos, highly specific acts of horrific, deeply personalized brutality violently unfolded that perfectly highlighted the complete, absolute loss of basic human empathy within the corrupted managerial ranks. One specific, highly aggressive Vietnamese manager, a man clearly identified in subsequent official legal records and testimonies as Quyen Trong, maliciously singled out a highly vulnerable, specific female worker who was desperately trying to navigate the violently shifting, panicked crowd to find safety. Armed heavily with a thick, heavy, solid iron pipe, Trong unleashed a savage, entirely unprovoked, and completely merciless beating directly upon the utterly defenseless, terrified woman. He aggressively struck her repeatedly with the dense, heavy metal weapon, the vicious blows raining down heavily upon her with a sickening, highly methodical, and relentless rhythm. The immense, crushing force of the heavy iron pipe striking repeatedly against her highly emaciated, fragile frame caused severe, immediate, and massive physical trauma. Her desperate, panicked attempts to raise her weak arms to shield her bleeding face and battered body proving entirely, tragically futile against the overwhelming, vicious, and sustained assault. The horrific, deeply disturbing sight of a senior supervisor brutally and relentlessly battering a starving, desperate worker from his exact own home country with a heavy piece of industrial metal plumbing serves as a chilling, highly definitive testament to the deeply corrupting, incredibly toxic, and highly dangerous environment that Kilsuli had carefully and deliberately cultivated. An environment where extreme cruelty was actively and continuously rewarded and basic human empathy was entirely and systematically eradicated. As the completely indiscriminate, highly vicious beating continued to aggressively rage violently across the entire blood-stained cafeteria floor, the level of violence rapidly and terrifyingly escalated from severe blunt force physical trauma to a state of permanent, utterly horrific, and life-altering physical mutilation. In the violently swirling, highly dangerous center of the chaotic panic, exactly where the sheer terror was most highly concentrated and the dangerous physical proximity to the aggressive attackers was absolutely most lethal, another terrified female worker suffered an incredibly specific injury of unimaginable, truly horrific severity. A violently aggressive attacker, actively wielding a highly sharpened, dangerous metal implement rapidly scavenged directly from the factory work floor, an item clearly described in various subsequent, detailed federal investigations as either a heavy, sharp metal screwdriver or a pair of heavy, lethally sharp industrial thread-cutting scissors violently and intentionally thrust the dangerous weapon directly and forcefully into the desperate victim's vulnerable face. The lethally sharp, entirely unyielding piece of solid metal pierced deeply and violently directly into her fragile eye, instantly and completely destroying the delicate, highly sensitive organ and instantly plunging her into an agonizing, completely permanent state of traumatic darkness on that side of her face. The sheer, deeply visceral, and entirely unimaginable horror of this incredibly specific, highly traumatic injury combined with the immediate, massive, and highly visible loss of blood, and the piercing, agonizing, utterly inhuman shrieks of the newly and permanently blinded woman, violently amplified the overall atmosphere of sheer terror within the enclosed room to an absolutely unbearable, entirely maddening, and deafening pitch. The bleak factory cafeteria had fully and entirely transformed into a deeply terrifying, completely lawless, and highly violent combat zone where permanent, life-altering physical disfigurement was dealt out casually and violently as a horrific, immediate penalty simply for daring to demand basic compensation for honest, exhausting daily labor. Eventually, the immense physical exertion required to maintain the savage, sustained beating slowly subsided as the attackers tired, leaving behind a completely horrifying, deeply blood-stained, and incredibly tragic tableau of immense human suffering. The once tightly crowded, tense cafeteria was now completely littered with the broken, severely bleeding, and highly traumatized bodies of the striking and paid workers. Many completely unable to physically stand, weeping openly and loudly in profound, agonizing physical pain and absolute, completely paralyzing, and completely inescapable fear. However, the temporary cessation of the highly active, violent physical assault absolutely did not mark the true end of the horrific, ongoing ordeal. Rather, it merely initiated a completely new, equally terrifying, and deeply insidious phase of highly calculated psychological and physical torture directed personally and immediately by the factory owner himself. If the brutal physical beating was specifically designed to violently break their physical bodies, the immediate, horrific aftermath was meticulously and coldly engineered by Kilsuli specifically to completely obliterate their remaining spirits and ensure total, unquestioning, and permanent submission. Walking slowly and calmly among the severely injured, heavily bleeding women, Lee exhibited an absolute, truly chilling, and completely sociopathic absence of any basic human empathy. He coldly surveyed the extensive, highly visible physical damage and immense suffering his direct orders had violently wrought, not with any sense of horror or regret, but with a cold, highly calculating, and deeply sinister satisfaction. Instead of immediately authorizing necessary, entirely urgent medical intervention for the severely injured victims lying on the floor, specifically including the desperate woman bleeding profusely from her completely destroyed eye and those suffering greatly from painfully shattered bones and deep, open physical lacerations, Lee immediately issued a direct command of staggering, truly sociopathic cruelty. He explicitly, loudly, and forcefully ordered that absolutely all access to any basic food, any clean drinking water, and any form of basic medical care or first aid be immediately, totally, and completely severed for absolutely anyone who had sustained any physical injuries during the brutal, violent assault. The badly wounded workers were deliberately, maliciously abandoned to suffer agonizing, untreated pain in the sweltering, highly unhygienic, and profoundly dirty heat of the enclosed factory environment. They're completely untreated, entirely open wounds rapidly becoming highly susceptible to severe, potentially completely life-threatening bacterial infections. By intentionally, continuously withholding the absolute most basic, entirely fundamental necessities of basic human survival and medical care, Lee effectively and coldly transformed the entire industrial compound into a closed, highly isolated, and deeply terrifying death camp floating silently in the absolute middle of the vast Pacific Ocean, maliciously utilizing the very real, highly immediate threat of a slow, deeply agonizing death by intentional medical neglect as his ultimate, completely unyielding, and absolute tool of total control. The final, completely devastating psychological blow to the severely traumatized victims' remaining autonomy arrived swiftly in the form of a heavily coerced, deeply deceptive, and highly fraudulent legal maneuver deliberately designed specifically to completely absolve the violent management of any future criminal responsibility for the brutal massacre. While the badly injured, highly traumatized women were still actively bleeding on the floor, suffering deeply from severe physical shock, and desperately, entirely terrified of immediately facing further severe physical violence, Lee's management team rapidly produced a series of freshly typewritten legal documents. These complex documents, drafted entirely and exclusively in complex English, a foreign language the vast majority of the captive, desperate workers could not comprehend in the absolute slightest, were essentially detailed, entirely fabricated, and completely false confessions. They falsely and maliciously stated that the workers themselves had aggressively and violently initiated the riot, that they had recklessly and intentionally caused all the extensive physical damage, and that the management had acted solely, legally, and reasonably in completely necessary self-defense. The highly aggressive, heavily armed guards and the violent, ruthless supervisors who had literally just delivered the savage, horrific beatings surrounded the opally weeping, physically incapacitated women, under the immediate, extremely credible, and deeply terrifying threat of further severe physical violence, and with heavy, dangerous weapons still visibly pointed directly and menacingly at them. The heavily bleeding, completely terrified victims were aggressively, physically forced to immediately sign their names to these entirely fabricated, highly fraudulent, and deeply deceptive documents. They were brutally compelled to legally validate their very own horrific abuse, effectively and permanently signing away their basic human rights while violently imprisoned within the very same walls where their own blood had just been mercilessly and violently spilled, officially cementing a profound, deeply inescapable, and entirely horrific tragedy of absolute and mitigated human exploitation. The heavy, suffocating silence that descended upon the Dewusa compound in the immediate aftermath of the November massacre was not the silence of peace or resolution, but rather the chilling, expectant silence of a graveyard. Inside the squalid barracks, the air remained thick with the metallic tang of untreated blood and the low, Rhythmic moaning of women who had been denied even the most basic medical care for their shattered limbs and ruined eyes. Kilsuli had effectively turned his industrial complex into a black hole of information, a place where the light of American justice seemed unable to penetrate. He believed that the sheer vastness of the Pacific Ocean, combined with his significant influence over local Samoan administrative structures, would act as an eternal shield against accountability. He operated with the arrogance of a man who thought he had successfully built a private kingdom where the rules of the civilized world simply did not apply. However, he had profoundly underestimated the one force that even the most brutal regimes struggle to fully contain: the sheer, unyielding resilience of the human spirit when it is pushed to the absolute edge of existence. The turning point of this investigation did not begin in a high-tech forensic laboratory or within the polished halls of a federal office in Washington, D.C. Instead, it began with a few terrified, starving women who decided that they would rather die trying to reach the outside world than live another single day in Lee's industrial purgatory. The first cracks in the wall of silence began to appear through a series of clandestine, high-stakes efforts that mirrored the tension of a Cold War spy thriller. Despite the confiscation of their passports and the constant, menacing presence of armed guards, the workers began to find small, ingenious ways to bypass the factory's ironclad security. Some women who had managed to hide a few meager coins or who had found a fleeting, sympathetic ear during their limited interactions outside the gates began to smuggle out desperate, handwritten messages. These were not long, detailed reports. They were frantic, heart-wrenching scraps of paper, sometimes written on the back of discarded labels or hidden within the very seams of the garments destined for the shelves of major American retailers. These messages eventually found their way into the hands of human rights advocates and labor organizations in the United States and Vietnam, describing a slave plantation operating openly under the American flag. When these initial reports first landed on the desks of federal investigators, they were met with a mixture of profound horror and deep skepticism. The idea that a modern, large-scale factory could be operating as a medieval-style feudal estate of torture in the year 2000 seemed almost impossible to believe. Yet, the consistency and the sheer, raw desperation of the voices calling out from the Pacific could not be ignored for long. The entry of the Federal Bureau of Investigation into the Dewisa case was hampered by the immense geographical and legal complexities of American Samoa. As an unincorporated territory, the islands exist in a unique and often confusing legal gray area, a place where local customs, traditional family ties, and the influence of powerful business interests often carry significantly more weight than federal statutes. Kilsuli had exploited this dynamic with surgical precision, weaving himself into the local social and political fabric and convincing much of the community that his factory was an essential, untouchable engine of the local economy. When FBI agents first touched down in the humid, oppressive heat of Pago Pago, they found themselves in a company town in the most literal and dangerous sense of the term. Every path they attempted to take was initially blocked by a formidable wall of silence, bureaucratic stalling, or blatant misinformation. Lee's management team had already been working tirelessly to prep local officials and the public with a deceptive narrative of ungrateful foreign workers who were prone to irrational violence and labor unrest. The fraudulent confessions Lee had coerced at Pipe Point from the bleeding victims were presented to the authorities as the definitive, legal record of the events of November 28th. To the federal investigators, the challenge was staggering in its scope. They were operating in a remote location where they were viewed with suspicion, and they were tasked with investigating a crime that was, at the time, still being legally defined in the American justice system. This was the era when the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was in its infancy, and the agents were essentially building the plane while flying it. The breakthrough in the investigation came not from a piece of physical evidence, but from a painstaking process of winning back the stolen trust of the victims. The FBI realized that as long as the interviews were conducted within the reach of Lee's influence, they would never hear the truth. They began to coordinate secret meetings, moving women to safe houses and hospital rooms away from the watchful, predatory eyes of the Korean and Vietnamese managers. In these quiet, protected spaces, the layers of lies finally began to peel away. The women, at first trembling and mute with the paralyzing fear of deportation or further violence, eventually found the courage to speak. They spoke of the systematic starvation, the years of withheld wages, and the terrifying, cold glint of the metal pipes in the hands of the men who were supposed to be their supervisors. They showed the agents their bodies the jagged, poorly healed scars across their backs and the haunting, empty socket where an eye had been violently gouged out. As the personal testimonies began to coalesce into a coherent and horrifying picture of systematic abuse, the physical investigation of the factory itself became a descent into a mechanical underworld. When the federal authorities finally executed a large-scale raid on the DeWusa compound, the jarring contrast between the sunny tropical exterior and the rotting industrial interior was laid bare for the world to see. Agents moved through the cafeteria, which still bore the faint, scrub-a-dat stains of the November violence. They recovered the very pipes and heavy tools that had been described with such terrifying detail in the victims' statements. They discovered the original copies of the fraudulent confessions, which were so uniform and linguistically complex that it was obvious they could not have been written by the Vietnamese-speaking workers who had been forced to sign them. In the administrative offices, investigators pored over financial records that revealed a shocking disparity. While Lee was accumulating millions of dollars in revenue from his garment contracts, his workers were literally starving for pennies that were never even paid. The low MD, the slaughterhouse, was no longer a secret whisper. It was now a documented federal crime scene. The investigation then entered a highly sensitive and dangerous phase as the government worked to protect the witnesses from Kilsalee's desperate attempts at damage control. Knowing that his empire was beginning to crumble, Lee escalated his tactics of intimidation. He attempted to destroy crucial payroll and personnel records and tried to manipulate the legal system to have the most vocal whistleblowers deported before they could testify in front of a grand jury. The FBI and the Department of Justice had to engage in a high-stakes race against time to secure the safety of the victims, eventually facilitating their transport to the American mainland where they could be shielded from Lee's reach. This logistical feat was a massive undertaking involving multiple federal agencies and non-governmental organizations, all working to ensure that the women who had survived the metal pipes would not be silenced by a corrupt legal maneuver. The process of gathering forensic evidence extended beyond the factory walls and into the digital and financial realms. As investigators tracked the flow of money and the communications between Lee and the recruitment agencies in Asia, proving that this was not a series of isolated incidents of abuse, but a highly organized, transnational criminal enterprise. The depth of the depravity uncovered during this period was a constant shock to even the most seasoned federal agents. They found evidence of women being forced to work while sick, of managers deliberately withholding water in the sweltering heat as a form of punishment, and of a complex system of fines designed to ensure that no worker could ever truly pay off their debt. The investigation revealed that the DeWusa factory was not just a failing business. It was a laboratory for human exploitation. Every aspect of the operation was designed to maximize profit by stripping away every ounce of human dignity. The American dream that had been sold to these women was systematically dismantled, revealing a core of pure, unadulterated greed. The investigators realized that Lee did not just want their labor, he wanted their total, abject submission. The turning point was reached when the federal government officially recognized the workers not as illegal immigrants or disgruntled employees, but as victims of a severe form of human trafficking. This designation was a legal and moral milestone, shifting the power dynamic entirely and signaling that the full weight of the United States government was now behind the women of DeWusa. As the case moved toward a formal indictment, the psychological toll on the investigators and the victims alike remained immense. The agents had to listen to hundreds of hours of testimony, each story more harrowing than the last, while the victims had to relive their trauma repeatedly for the sake of the legal record. Yet, in this grueling process, a sense of community and purpose began to emerge among the survivors. For the first time since they had arrived in Samoa, they were being heard. They were being treated as human beings whose lives and suffering mattered. The investigation proved that while Kilsily had the power to break bones and steal years of their lives, he had failed to extinguish their collective will to see him face justice. The raid on the factory and the subsequent collection of evidence was the beginning of the end for the slave plantation in the Pacific. The myth of Lee's invincibility had been shattered, and the path to the courtroom was now being paved with the very evidence he had tried so desperately to bury. The investigation had successfully pulled the DeWusa case out of the shadows of a remote territory and placed it squarely in the spotlight of the American legal system, setting the stage for a trial that would make history and change the way the world views the hidden costs of global labor. The transition from the sweltering, isolated industrial compound of Pago Pago to the sterile, high-ceilinged environment of a federal courtroom represented far more than a simple change in geography. It was the moment the carefully constructed reality of Kilsily began to collide with the absolute, unyielding machinery of the United States federal justice system. For the hundreds of workers who had survived the horrors of the DeWusa factory, the trial was an almost surreal experience. They had spent years in a state of absolute subjugation, where the word of one man was the only law that mattered and where the mere mention of American authorities was used as a terrifying threat of deportation and ruin. Now they found themselves standing in the very heart of that authority, not as criminals or illegal trespassers, but as the primary witnesses for the prosecution. The courtroom became a theater of profound transformation, where the power dynamics that had defined their lives for so long were systematically dismantled. Kilsily, once an untouchable figure of absolute authority who had commanded their every movement and controlled their access to food and water, was now a man confined by the rules of evidence and the watchful eye of a federal judge. He sat at the defense table, his presence stripped of the menacing aura he had cultivated within the factory walls, yet his gaze often remained sharp and defiant. A chilling reminder of the man who had once ordered his managers to break the spirits of the women in his charge. The legal significance of this trial cannot be overstated, as it marked the very first major application of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. This newly enacted federal statute was designed specifically to address the nuances of modern-day slavery, recognizing that coercion does not always require physical shackles or iron bars. The prosecution faced the immense challenge of proving that Lee had created an environment so permeated by fear, debt, and psychological manipulation that the workers were effectively enslaved. They had to demonstrate that the withholding of passports, the imposition of fraudulent debts, and the constant threat of deportation constituted a form of forced labor that violated the core principles of human dignity. The trial was a grueling process that lasted 4 weeks, requiring a massive logistical effort to transport survivors and translate their testimonies into English for the record. For the jury, listening to the sequence of events was like peering into a dark, hidden corner of the world that they never realized existed on American soil. The prosecution meticulously laid out the evidence, beginning with the glossy recruitment brochures that promised a life of prosperity, and ending with the blood-stained physical remnants of the November massacre. The most powerful and gut-wrenching moments of the trial occurred when the victims themselves took the stand. One by one, women who had been broken and battered by Lee's regime stood before the court to tell their stories. Their testimonies were a raw, unfiltered catalog of human suffering. They spoke of the overwhelming hunger that had become a constant companion, the humiliating living conditions in the overcrowded barracks, and the crushing weight of the debts they carried on behalf of their families. The courtroom was often thick with a heavy, mournful silence as the translators conveyed the details of their daily lives under Lee's thumb. The most harrowing testimony came from the woman who had been permanently blinded during the attack in the cafeteria. As she described the moment the sharp metal instrument pierced her eye and the subsequent days of agonizing pain without any medical attention, the reality of the DeWusa slaughterhouse became undeniable. Her presence in the courtroom was a living monument to the physical cost of Lee's greed. She spoke not with anger, but with a quiet, devastating clarity that pierced through the legal jargon and the technical arguments of the defense. Kil-Soo Lee's defense team attempted to frame the entire situation as a series of unfortunate labor disputes that had simply spiraled out of control. They argued that Lee was a struggling businessman trying to manage an unruly and ungrateful workforce in a difficult economic climate. They tried to shift the blame onto the managers, claiming that the violence of November 28th was a spontaneous reaction by the supervisors to a riotous situation and that Lee himself had never authorized such brutality. They even attempted to use the coerced confessions that Lee had forced the bleeding victims to sign as evidence that the workers were the true aggressors. However, this narrative quickly crumbled under the sheer volume of evidence presented by the government. The prosecution presented payroll records that showed millions of dollars flowing into Lee's accounts while his workers received nothing. They produced internal communications that proved Lee was fully aware of the conditions in the factory and that he had personally directed the tactics of intimidation. Most importantly, the physical evidence of the weapons used, the heavy iron pipes and the sharpened tools, belied any claim that the management was acting in reasonable self-defense against a group of starving, unarmed women. As the trial progressed, the focus also turned toward the enforcers who had carried out Lee's orders with such chilling efficiency. Managers like Quyen Trong were forced to confront the specific acts of violence they had committed. The prosecution detailed how Trong had used a heavy metal pipe to systematically beat a defenseless woman, highlighting the betrayal inherent in his actions as he attacked someone from his own homeland. The testimony revealed a hierarchy of cruelty where those who were willing to inflict pain were rewarded with better food and relative safety, while those who resisted were subjected to even greater deprivation. The trial exposed the psychological architecture of the factory, showing how Lee had used cultural ties and the desperation of the supervisors to create a self-sustaining system of abuse. The enforcers were not just mindless thugs. They were participants in a calculated system that traded human empathy for a perceived sense of power and survival within Lee's empire. The deliberation of the jury was a period of intense anxiety for the survivors, many of whom still feared that Lee's influence might somehow reach into the jury room. For these women, a verdict of not guilty would have been a death sentence for their faith in justice. When the jury finally returned with their decision, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The verdict was a sweeping and total condemnation of Kil-Soo Lee and his criminal enterprise. He was found guilty on multiple counts of human trafficking, conspiracy to violate civil rights, forced labor, and extortion. The legal victory was complete, validating every claim the workers had made and marking a historic precedent for the prosecution of human trafficking in the United States. The courtroom, which had been a place of such intense trauma and confrontation, suddenly became a place of profound relief. Some of the survivors wept openly, not from sorrow this time, but from the overwhelming realization that their long nightmare was finally, legally, and permanently over. The sentencing phase of the trial was the final act in this pursuit of accountability. The federal judge, in considering the gravity of the crimes, noted the exceptional cruelty and the systematic nature of the abuse that had occurred under the American flag. The sentences handed down reflected the horror of the case. Kil-Soo Lee was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, a term that ensured he would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. It was one of the harshest sentences ever recorded for a human trafficking case at that time, sending a clear and unambiguous message to any other corporate interests that might consider exploiting vulnerable populations for profit. The managers who had participated in the violence also received significant prison terms, with some being sentenced to over a decade for their roles in the beatings and the coercion of the workers. These sentences were not just punishments for the individuals involved. They were a declaration by the United States government that the lives of migrant workers were protected by the same constitutional rights as any other person on American soil. The verdict and the subsequent sentences served as a catalyst for a broader national conversation about the hidden realities of the global garment industry. The Daewoosa case forced major retailers and the public to confront the fact that made in the USA did not always guarantee a sweatshop-free product. It highlighted the critical need for better oversight of manufacturing facilities in remote territories and for stronger protections for guest workers who are often the most invisible and vulnerable members of the labor force. For the victims, the conclusion of the trial provided the legal closure they needed to begin the slow, difficult process of rebuilding their lives. While the physical scars and the trauma of the November massacre would remain with them forever, they walked out of that courtroom with something they had been denied for years: their dignity, their freedom, and the recognition that their voices had finally been heard. The trial of Kilsuli was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a reclamation of justice in the heart of the Pacific, a moment where the light of the law finally reached into the darkest corners of the Dewusa factory and brought a definitive end to a modern-day slave plantation. When the final echo of the judge's gavel faded into the hallowed silence of the courtroom, and the steel doors of the transport van locked Kilsuli away for what would essentially be the rest of his natural life, a profound and heavy quiet settled over the case of Dewusa Samoa. For the survivors, the legal victory was an undeniable triumph, a moment of validation that many had never dared to dream of during those long, dark months of starvation in Pago Pago. Yet, as the cameras were packed away and the headlines began to shift toward the next cycle of news, the true aftermath of the nightmare began to unfold in the quiet, private lives of the women who had endured it. Justice, as it turns out, is a definitive legal act, but healing is a slow, messy, and often incomplete process. The conclusion of the trial did not magically erase the scars on their backs or restore the light to a ruined eye. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter where these women had to navigate the complex, often overwhelming reality of a freedom they had nearly died to secure. The American dream they had chased across the Pacific had finally been granted to them, but it was a dream born from the ashes of a horrific reality, and its taste was bittersweet. For many of the survivors, the most immediate and life-changing consequence of the trial was the opportunity to remain in the United States. Under the newly established protections of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, many were granted T visas, a specific legal status designed for victims of severe forms of human trafficking who assist in the prosecution of their captors. This was the ultimate irony of their journey. They had finally achieved the legal right to live and work on the American mainland, but they had arrived there not as the successful, wealthy providers they had hoped to be, but as the broken witnesses of a federal crime. Moving from the isolated, tropical enclave of American Samoa to the vast, bustling landscapes of the continental United States was a second culture shock, one that brought its own set of challenges. They were no longer trapped behind corrugated metal walls, but they were now navigating a society where they lacked language skills, social networks, and the basic financial means to start over. They transitioned from being components in Kilsuli's factory to being immigrants in a country that often struggled to see the humanity behind the statistics of labor exploitation. The psychological toll of the Dewusa experience remained a constant, invisible companion for the survivors long after they settled into their new lives in cities across America. The factory mind, a state of hypervigilance and absolute submissiveness cultivated by months of systematic abuse, does not simply disappear with a change of scenery. Many of the women suffered from profound post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by the rhythmic thud of the sewing machines and the terrifying memory of the heavy iron pipes. Simple, everyday actions, like eating a full meal or walking freely down a street, were often shadowed by a lingering sense of guilt or a reflexive fear that the management would somehow reappear to punish them. The woman who had been permanently blinded carried the most visible reminder of the massacre, a physical darkness that forced her to relearn how to navigate the world. For her, and for many others, the American dream was now a quiet, hard-fought existence defined by the struggle to reclaim a sense of agency over their own bodies and their own futures. Back in their home villages in Vietnam and China, the aftermath of the Dewusa case rippled through the communities in complex ways. While the news of the trial's success brought a sense of relief, it did not immediately solve the crushing financial crisis that had been the catalyst for the journey in the first place. The massive debts owed to recruitment agencies and local moneylenders did not vanish because Kilsuli went to prison. Families who had mortgaged their ancestral lands were still facing the very real threat of foreclosure and ruin. The remittances that the women had hoped to send home were replaced by the meager support they could scrape together while working low-wage jobs in the U.S. and trying to pay off their own legal and medical expenses. The hero's return that many had envisioned coming home with suitcases full of gifts and pockets full of American dollars was replaced by a long-distance digital connection to families who were proud of their survival but still struggling in the same poverty that had sent the women across the ocean years before. The DeWusa case also left a permanent mark on the landscape of American Samoa. The factory compound, once a bustling hive of industrial activity and a site of unimaginable suffering, eventually fell into a state of quiet, tropical decay. The massive corrugated metal buildings, which had once baked under the sun and echoed with the screams of the November massacre, became ghosts of the island's industrial past. Over time, the lush, aggressive vegetation of the South Pacific began to reclaim the site, vines creeping over the fences and rust eating away at the gates that had once held hundreds of souls captive. For the local community in Pago Pago, the factory remained a somber reminder of a time when the island's reputation for hospitality and family values had been tarnished by a foreign predator. The case forced a painful reckoning with the ways in which local systems had been manipulated and how easily the most vulnerable members of society can be hidden in plain sight, even in a place where everyone is supposed to be family. On a systemic level, the legacy of the DeWusa trial fundamentally transformed the way the United States government approaches the issue of human trafficking. It served as a landmark case study for the FBI, the Department of Justice, and labor advocates around the world. It proved that the Made in USA label was not an infallible shield against exploitation and that federal oversight needed to be far more rigorous in remote territories. The case led to a permanent shift in how labor trafficking is identified and prosecuted, moving away from a narrow focus on physical restraints and toward a more sophisticated understanding of psychological coercion, debt bondage, and the weaponization of immigration status. The bravery of the DeWusa women essentially paved the way for thousands of other victims of modern slavery to seek justice under the law. Their willingness to stand in that courtroom and relive their trauma became the foundation for a more robust, more empathetic legal framework that continues to protect migrant workers today. However, the case also serves as a haunting reflection on the persistent, dark underside of global consumerism. The DeWusa factory did not operate in a vacuum. It was a link in a supply chain that fed the appetites of major American retailers and millions of unsuspecting consumers. The clothes produced in that slaughterhouse were sold in malls across the country, their low prices made possible by the very starvation and violence that the trial eventually exposed. The reflections that emerge from this case are a direct challenge to the modern world. What is the true cost of our comfort? The DeWusa story reminds us that when we seek the lowest possible price, there is often someone somewhere paying the difference with their dignity, their health, or their life. It is a reminder that the American dream can be easily perverted into a nightmare when profit is placed above the fundamental sanctity of human life. In the final analysis, the story of the DeWusa Samoa massacre is not just a story of a crime and its punishment. It is a story about the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of truth. Kilsoli had everything on his side: wealth, influence, a remote location, and a captive workforce that didn't speak the language of their oppressors. He had every reason to believe he was untouchable. And yet, he was brought down by the very people he thought were the most insignificant. He was defeated by the collective courage of women who refused to be broken, who held onto their humanity even when they were being treated like machines. Their victory in that federal courtroom was a declaration that no person is disposable and that no corner of the earth is too remote for the light of justice to reach. As we look back on this case, we are left with the image of that emerald island in the Pacific, a place of breathtaking beauty that once harbored a terrible secret. We think of the women who are now living their lives in various corners of the United States, perhaps working in kitchens, in hospitals, or in other factories, carrying the memories of Samoa with them every day. They are the living legacy of a tragedy that should never have happened, and their presence is a quiet, powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle for human rights in an interconnected world. The Dewusa factory is gone, its metal walls rusted and its sewing machine silent, but the lessons of what happened inside those walls must never be forgotten. We must remember the names and the faces of those who suffered, not as victims, but as the survivors who fought for their lives and, in doing so, helped to make the world a little safer for those who come after them. The American dream in Samoa was a nightmare of greed, but the justice that followed was a testament to the fact that even in the most isolated reaches of the ocean, the call for freedom can never be truly silenced. The story of Dewusa is a somber chapter in the history of the Pacific, a narrative that begins with the hope of a better life and ends with a hard one, expensive peace. It stands as a warning to those who would exploit the vulnerable and as a beacon of hope for those who find themselves trapped in the shadows of the global economy. As the sun sets over the harbor in Pago Pago, the mountains still glow with that same emerald light that first greeted the workers years ago. The island remains a paradise, but it is a paradise that now knows the cost of its own isolation. And for the women who once called that tin factory their home, the ocean is no longer a wall, but a vast, open horizon, a symbol of the freedom they earned through blood, tears, and an unyielding belief that they deserve to be seen. This concludes our deep dive into the harrowing events at the Dewusa factory in American Samoa. It is a story that stays with you, a reminder of the fragility of human rights and the immense strength required to reclaim them. If this story has moved you, we encourage you to look deeper into the origins of the products you use every day and to support the organizations that continue to fight against human trafficking and labor exploitation. Around the globe, the fight for justice didn't end with the sentencing of Kilsili. It continues every day in the efforts to ensure that no other slaughterhouse can ever operate in the shadows again. Thank you for listening, for bearing witness to the stories of these survivors, and for remembering that behind every statistic and every news report, there is a human being whose life, whose pain, and whose triumph matters. The passage of time has a curious and often deceptive way of smoothing over the jagged edges of even the most horrific tragedies, turning visceral pain into distant history and transforming active crime scenes into overgrown ruins. In the year 2026, looking back across a quarter of a century since the walls of the Dewusa factory finally fell silent, the legacy of what happened in Pago Pago remains as a profound and unsettling landmark in the landscape of human rights. This case did not merely end with a prison sentence for one man. It acted as the catalyst for a fundamental shift in how the modern world perceives, defines, and prosecutes the oldest of crimes under the newest of guises. As we examine the final echoes of this story, we must look at how the blood spilled on that linoleum cafeteria floor in November 2000 became the ink used to write the most significant anti-trafficking laws of the 21st century. The horror of Dewusa was the crucible in which the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was truly tested and forged, moving it from a theoretical piece of legislation into a sharp, functional weapon for justice. Before this case, the concept of slavery was often viewed through a historical lens, something belonging to a different era and a different set of laws. But the systematic exploitation orchestrated by Kilsili proved that slavery is a shapeshifter capable of hiding within the sterile, industrial language of production quotas, recruitment fees, and corporate contracts. The evolution of the legal framework following the Dewusa trial represents one of the most significant shifts in American jurisprudence regarding labor. The prosecution successfully argued that coercion was not just a matter of physical force, but a complex psychological and financial architecture. This precedent fundamentally changed how federal investigators approach the concept of debt bondage. In the decades since, the lessons learned from the starving women in Samoa have been applied to thousands of cases involving agricultural workers in the South, domestic workers in major metropolitan areas, and laborers in the massive construction projects that define our modern cities. The legal system finally began to recognize that a confiscated passport and an insurmountable, fraudulent debt are just as effective as iron shackles in stripping a human being of their freedom. The Dewusa case taught the Department of Justice that to find the truth, they had to look past the official payroll records and the signed confessions to the raw, lived experience of the workers themselves. This shift toward victim-centered investigations is perhaps the most enduring legal legacy of the case, ensuring that the voice of the exploited carries more weight than the fabricated documents of the exploiter. Beyond the courtroom, the DeWusa scandal triggered a seismic shift in the world of global commerce and corporate social responsibility. In the late 90s, major American retail brands operated with a level of detachment that allowed them to turn a blind eye to the conditions within their third-party manufacturing sites. The revelation that garments labeled as made under the American flag were actually produced by starving, beaten captives forced a painful and necessary reckoning. It shattered the comfortable illusion that distance and subcontracting could absolve a corporation of its moral and legal responsibilities. In the years following the trial, the industry saw the birth of much more rigorous social auditing processes and the implementation of strict codes of conduct that are now standard across the globe. While the system is still far from perfect, the ghosts of DeWusa continue to haunt every boardroom meeting where labor costs are discussed. The case served as a permanent warning that a brand's reputation is only as strong as the weakest link in its supply chain, and that the hidden cost of a cheap t-shirt can eventually be paid in the devastating currency of federal indictments and public disgrace. The psychological long tail of this tragedy is perhaps the most difficult aspect to quantify, yet it is the most vital to remember. For the survivors who remained in the United States, the journey did not end with the verdict. They became the pioneers of a new type of American community, one composed of people who had seen the absolute worst of the American dream yet still possessed the resilience to build a future within it. These women, many of whom are now grandmothers, carry the history of DeWusa in their very movements and in the quiet, guarded way they talk about their past. Their integration into American society was not just an act of immigration, it was an act of reclamation. They had to reclaim their sense of safety, their ability to trust authority, and their belief that their labor had inherent value. The support networks and non-governmental organizations that grew up around these survivors helped to create a blueprint for how to support victims of modern slavery. Recognizing that the needs for psychological counseling and community connection are just as urgent as the need for legal status. Their lives today are a quiet, powerful defiance of Kilsuli's attempt to turn them into disposable objects. In American Samoa itself, the memory of the factory is a complex and often somber thread in the local historical narrative. The islands, known for the deep and sacred traditions of Fasamoa and the importance of family and community, had to reconcile their cultural identity with the fact that such a profound evil had operated within their borders. The case forced a conversation about the vulnerability of remote territories and the risks of allowing industrial interests to operate with too much autonomy and too little oversight. Today, the industrial park in Pago Pago has moved on to other ventures, but the physical site of the DeWusa plant remains a place of reflection for those who know its history. It stands as a reminder that paradise is never immune to the intrusion of greed and that the protection of the vulnerable requires a constant, vigilant effort from every member of society. The local community has, in its own way, worked to heal from the stigma of the case, emphasizing the values of hospitality and protection that were so cruelly violated by Lee and his associates. The global perspective on the DeWusa case reveals that it was not an isolated anomaly, but a symptom of a much larger and more persistent disease. The same dynamics of recruitment debt, geographical isolation, and the weaponization of immigration status that define the Samoa factory are still being used today in various corners of the world. From the fishing fleets of Southeast Asia to the electronics factories of Eastern Europe, the slaughterhouse in Pago Pago was a localized eruption of a global phenomenon that continues to challenge our commitment to human rights. However, the difference today is that we have the tools and the precedents to fight back. Every time a human trafficking ring is dismantled or a corrupt labor recruiter is brought to justice, there is a direct line that can be drawn back to the women who stood up in that federal courtroom in 2001. Their courage provided the legal and moral roadmap for a global movement that refuses to accept slavery as an inevitable byproduct of a globalized economy. We must also reflect on our own role as consumers in this ongoing narrative. The Daewoosa case is a mirror held up to a society that demands infinite growth and bottom-line pricing without always asking about the human toll. It reminds us that our purchasing power is a moral choice and that every transaction connects us to a human being on the other side of the world. The lesson of the factory is that we cannot afford to be passive observers of the supply chain. We have a responsibility to demand transparency, to support fair labor practices, and to remember that the items we wear and use are the products of human hands, human time, and human dignity. The story of the blinded woman and the beaten workers is not just a tragedy to be consumed as entertainment. It is a call to action to ensure that our convenience is never built on the foundation of someone else's captivity. The final tribute in this long and harrowing chronicle must be paid to the survivors themselves. They are the true heroes of this story, the ones who turn their suffering into a catalyst for change. Their strength is a testament to the fact that the human spirit possesses a resilience that can survive even the most calculated attempts at destruction. They were targeted because they were thought to be invisible and voiceless, yet they became the most powerful voices in the fight for justice. Their names may not be widely known, but their impact is felt every time a worker is protected by the laws they helped to validate. They took a nightmare of exploitation and turned it into a legacy of empowerment, proving that even in the most remote reaches of the Pacific, the demand for justice can create a wave that changes the world. As we conclude this series, we are left with a final, haunting image of the island of Tutuila. The sun still rises over the emerald peaks, and the waves still crash against the reef with a timeless, rhythmic beauty. The physical factory may be gone, but the story of what happened there remains as a vital part of our collective consciousness. It is a story that demands we stay awake, that we stay vigilant, and that we never forget the value of a single human life in the face of immense, systemic pressure. The Daewoosa Samoa case is a dark chapter, certainly, but it is also a story of a light that refused to be extinguished. It is a reminder that even in the deepest darkness of a modern-day slave plantation, the light of truth and the pursuit of justice can eventually find a way to break through. The legacy of Daewoosa is not just a warning. It is a promise that no matter how far someone is taken, no matter how much is stolen from them, their dignity remains an inalienable part of who they are, and there will always be those who are willing to fight to bring them home. This deep exploration of the Daewoosa tragedy serves as a final meditation on the cost of progress and the necessity of compassion. It is a narrative that began with the deceptive promise of the American dream and ended with the hard-won reality of American justice. The survivors moved from the shadows of a tin factory into the light of a new life, and in doing so, they left behind a world that is slightly more aware, slightly more just, and significantly more committed to the idea that no person should ever be treated as a commodity. We honor their journey by telling their story, by remembering their names, and by continuing the work they started, the work of ensuring that every person, no matter where they are from or what they do, can live and work in a world defined by freedom, respect, and the absolute protection of their fundamental human rights. The physical remains of the Daewoosa factory on the island of Tutuila serve as a silent, decaying monument to a chapter of American history that many would prefer to leave buried beneath the lush, encroaching tropical canopy. The salt-heavy air of the Pacific and the relentless humidity have done what the legal system could only do on paper. They have slowly dismantled the physical infrastructure of Kilsuli's empire. The corrugated metal sheets that once vibrated with the screams of the November massacre are now rusted into fragile orange lace, yielding to the persistent strength of island vines and the slow, rhythmic creep of the jungle. Inside those ruins, the floor where blood was once spilled is now covered in a layer of silt and fallen leaves. And the silence is so profound that it is hard to imagine the mechanical whir of hundreds of sewing machines that once defined the lives of the women trapped there. This physical decay mirrors the way the public memory of the case has faded, yet for those who survived, the memory is not a ruin. It is a living, breathing part of their daily existence. The transition from the violent industrialism of the factory to the quiet, often lonely lives they eventually found in the United States represents one of the most significant and underreported human rights journeys of the 21st century. The psychological journey of the Dewusa survivors from the status of human machinery to that of autonomous citizens was a process fraught with invisible obstacles. When the federal government granted T visas to these women, it was a profound legal victory, but it also placed them in a unique and challenging social position. They were individuals who had survived a modern-day slave plantation, yet they were now expected to integrate into the very society whose consumer demands had indirectly fueled their exploitation. Many of these women settled in Vietnamese American communities in states like California, Washington, and Texas, seeking the comfort of a shared language and culture that had been so cruelly weaponized against them by the managers in Samoa. In these new environments, they faced the daunting task of explaining a trauma that defied conventional understanding. How do you tell a new neighbor or a potential employer that you spent years in an American territory being starved and beaten for a wage that never came? The stigma of their experience, combined with the profound PTSD that lingers after such systematic abuse, meant that many survivors lived in a state of quiet hypervigilance, forever looking over their shoulders for a shadow of the chicken who had once controlled their every breath. The legacy of the Dewusa case also forces a difficult and necessary examination of the concept of the American dream as it applies to the most vulnerable members of the global workforce. For Kilsey, the American dream was a loophole, a way to exploit the protections of the U.S. flag while operating with the impunity of a lawless warlord. For the workers, the dream was a nightmare that they had to pay for in blood. This duality remains at the heart of the global labor conversation today. The case proved that the legal boundary of a nation is not always a guarantee of the protection of human rights. It showed that in the remote reaches of the Pacific, or in any isolated industrial zone, a person can be on American soil and yet be entirely outside the reach of American law for years. This realization led to a fundamental restructuring of how federal agencies like the Department of Labor and the FBI monitor manufacturing in U.S. territories. The Samoa model of exploitation characterized by debt bondage, document confiscation, and geographical isolation became the textbook example of what the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was designed to eradicate. Every training seminar for modern federal agents and every human rights workshop for international labor monitors still references the Dewusa factory as the definitive warning of how easily an industrial facility can transform into a labor camp. Furthermore, the Dewusa tragedy serves as an enduring critique of the ethical blindness inherent in the global supply chain. The garments produced by the starving women in Pago Pago did not disappear. They were worn by Americans who had no idea that the Made in USA label on their clothing was a mark of shame. This disconnect between the consumer and the producer is the engine that allows modern slavery to persist. The trial of Kilsey pulled back the curtain on this reality, but the curtain has a tendency to close again as soon as the headlines fade. The reflections that emerge from this case demand that we consider our own participation in these systems. When we buy a product, we are not just acquiring an object. We are endorsing the conditions under which it was made. The women of Dewusa were not just victims of one man's greed. They were victims of a global system that prioritizes the lowest possible production cost above the basic survival of the producer. The case remains a call to action for a more conscious and transparent form of capitalism. One that recognizes the inherent dignity of the worker as a non-negotiable component of every contract and every purchase. The investigators who brought the case to light also carry a lasting burden from their time in the Pacific. For many FBI agents and Department of Justice attorneys, the Dewusa investigation was the most significant and emotionally taxing work of their careers. They had to witness the physical and psychological devastation of hundreds of women, and they had to fight a legal battle against a defendant who used every trick in the book to avoid accountability. The success of the prosecution was a testament to their persistence and their commitment to a version of American justice that actually protects the poor and the marginalized. However, many of those investigators have spoken in the years since about the shadow of the factory, the lingering sense of frustration that such an operation could exist for so long in plain sight. They remain vocal advocates for the survivors, recognizing that while the legal case is closed, the moral obligation to these women remains unfulfilled. Their work proved that while justice can be slow and expensive, it is the only force capable of dismantling the structures of modern slavery. As we look toward the future, the story of the Dewusa factory stands as both a tragedy and a beacon. It is a tragedy because of the lives that were shattered and the years that were stolen from people who only wanted to help their families. It is a beacon because of the incredible courage shown by the victims who chose to fight back. Their story is a reminder that the demand for human rights is a universal instinct that cannot be crushed by metal pipes or silenced by starvation. The women of Dewusa were the ones who truly defined what it means to be a hero in the modern era. They did not have weapons, they did not have money, and they did not have a voice in the halls of power. Yet they brought down a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise and changed the laws of the most powerful nation on earth. Their legacy is not just a legal precedent. It is a testament to the fact that truth has a power all its own. A power that can travel across oceans and through the walls of the most fortified factories. The final reflection on this case must be one of solemn remembrance and active vigilance. We must remember the woman who lost her eye, the women who lost their youth to the sewing lines, and the families who were ruined by the debts of the recruitment fees. We must remember that the fight against human trafficking is not a historical event, but an ongoing struggle that requires our constant attention and our refusal to be silent. The Dewusa factory may be a ruin, but the forces that created it are still at work in the world today. Every time we hear about a labor dispute in a remote corner of the globe or a recruitment fee for a migrant worker, we should think of Pago Pago. We should think of the November massacre and the courage of the survivors who stood up in court to say, no more. Their victory was a hard-won peace, a reclamation of dignity from the jaws of a predatory system. It is a story that should be told to every generation, a narrative of survival that proves that even in the darkest slaughterhouse, the light of justice can eventually find a way in. The island of Tutuila remains one of the most beautiful places on Earth, a place where the mountains meet the sea in a breathtaking display of natural grandeur. But for those who know the story of Dewusa, the beauty is now tempered by a profound understanding of the darkness that can hide within it. The island has healed, and the survivors have moved on, but the story remains as a permanent part of the Pacific's history. It is a story of a modern-day slave plantation that was destroyed by the very people it sought to enslave. As the waves continue to hit the reef and the jungle continues to grow over the rusted remains of the factory, let us ensure that the lessons of Dewusa are never forgotten. Let us honor the survivors by being the kind of consumers and the kind of citizens who refuse to let the American dream be built on the suffering of others. Their journey from the barracks to the courtroom, and eventually to a life of freedom, is a powerful reminder that justice is not just a word in a law book. It is a promise that we must keep to every human being, regardless of who they are or where they come from. This final chapter of our series on the Dewusa Samoa case is a meditation on the enduring strength of the human spirit and the collective responsibility we share to protect the vulnerable. It is a story that began in the hope of a better life and ended in a landmark victory for human rights. The women of Dewusa are no longer victims. They are the architects of a more just world. Their courage is the true legacy of this case, a legacy that will continue to inspire and inform the fight for freedom for generations to come. Thank you for following this journey through one of the most challenging and significant cases in the history of the American justice system. May the stories of these survivors stay with you, and may their courage be a reminder that no one is truly invisible as long as there are those willing to listen and to act in the name of truth and justice. While the finality of the courtroom in Hawaii provided a definitive legal end to the reign of Kilsuli, the true scope of the Dewusa tragedy cannot be measured solely by the length of a prison sentence or the tally of a guilty verdict. To truly understand the magnitude of what occurred in that corrugated metal fortress in American Samoa, one must look toward the thousands of miles of invisible threads that connected the factory floor to the quiet, expectant villages of rural Vietnam and China. For every woman who stood trembling in the cafeteria on that horrific November morning, there was a family back home whose very survival was tethered to the success of her journey. The news of the massacre and the subsequent trial did not arrive in these villages through official government communiques or polished news reports. Instead, it filtered through in fragments of panicked phone calls, hushed rumors, and eventually the terrifying silence of missing remittances. In the small, humid homes of Haiphong or the agricultural stretches of the Mekong Delta, the American dream had been sold as a golden ticket, a way to pay for a parent's surgery, a sibling's education, or the construction of a modest brick home. When the reality of the Daewoo slaughterhouse finally broke through the recruitment agency's lies, it did not just break the hearts of these families. It threatened to bury them under a mountain of insurmountable, predatory debt that would take generations to clear. The predatory nature of the recruitment process was the hidden engine of the Daewoo machine, a system of debt bondage that functioned with the cold precision of a bank but the ruthless violence of a street gang. These women were not just employees, they were essentially financial hostages before they even stepped onto the plane for Pago Pago. The recruitment fees, which often ranged from $5,000 to $8,000, represented an astronomical sum in the context of the local Vietnamese economy. To raise this capital, families did not simply dip into savings. They engaged in a desperate, high-stakes gamble with their only assets. They mortgaged ancestral lands that had been in their families for centuries. They borrowed from local moneylenders at interest rates that were designed to ensure they could never be repaid. And they pledged their future labor as collateral. When Kilsu Lee chose to withhold wages for months on end, he wasn't just being a bad boss or a greedy businessman. He was knowingly and intentionally triggering a domino effect of financial ruin across the Pacific. He understood that the terror of losing a family home was a more effective tool of control than any physical guard. This psychological leverage was the true genius of his cruelty, ensuring that the workers would endure almost any level of starvation or physical abuse if they thought there was even a flickering chance of eventually being paid and saving their families from bankruptcy. As the federal investigation deepened and the horrific details of the November 28th assault began to circulate, a secondary crisis emerged within the corporate boardrooms of some of America's most recognizable retail brands. For years, these companies had benefited from the low-cost production at the Daewoo plant, shielded by a doctrine of plausible deniability and a lack of transparency in the subcontracting process. The Made in USA label had been a powerful marketing tool, a signal to consumers that the garments were produced under the highest labor standards in the world. The revelation that these clothes were actually the product of a slave plantation created a PR nightmare that forced a fundamental shift in the industry. The retailers' initial defense that they had no direct knowledge of the conditions at the factory began to ring hollow as the sheer scale and duration of the abuse became clear. The federal government's use of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in this case sent a shockwave through the global garment industry, signaling that ignorance was no longer a valid legal or moral defense. It forced these massive corporations to acknowledge that their supply chains were not just lines on a spreadsheet, but real-world networks involving vulnerable human beings whose lives were their responsibility. This era of corporate accountability, born from the suffering of the Daewoo workers, led to the creation of much more rigorous monitoring systems. Though the struggle to eliminate sweatshops in remote territories remains a persistent and uphill battle, the internal hierarchy of the Daewoo factory also warrants a closer, more somber examination, particularly the role of the Vietnamese managers who turned against their own people. This was perhaps the most insidious aspect of Kilsu Lee's management style. He did not just use external force to maintain order. He actively corrupted the cultural and national ties that should have been a source of support for the workers. By elevating certain individuals like Quyen Trong to positions of relative power and rewarding them for their loyalty with better food and housing, Lee created a system of proximal oppression. These managers were themselves trapped in a different kind of cage, believing that their own survival depended on their willingness to be more brutal than the guards. The betrayal felt by the workers when their own countrymen picked up iron pipes and sharpened tools to beat them was a psychological wound that proved far more difficult to heal than any broken bone. It created a deep, lasting sense of fragmentation within the community, as survivors had to reconcile the fact that their oppressors shared their language, their history, and their heritage. This dynamic is a common feature of high-intensity trafficking operations, where the breakdown of trust between victims is a primary goal of the captors, ensuring that collective resistance is nearly impossible to organize. For the survivors who transitioned into life on the American mainland, the years following the trial were defined by a strange and often lonely duality. They were celebrated as heroes of a landmark legal case, yet they were living in a society that was largely indifferent to the nuances of their trauma. The T visas provided them with legal status, but they did not provide them with a sense of belonging. Many survivors struggled with the profound guilt of being the lucky ones who got to stay in America, while their families back in Vietnam were still grappling with the financial fallout of the recruitment debts. They worked long, grueling hours in service jobs or other factories, sending every spare cent back home to pay off the moneylenders who were still knocking on their parents' doors. The American dream for them was not about upward mobility or personal luxury. It was a grim, determined slug to erase the debt that Kilsuli had manufactured. Their lives were a testament to the fact that freedom is not just the absence of shackles, but the ability to live without the crushing weight of an unpayable debt. These women became the silent backbone of many immigrant communities, their stories of survival shared only in whispers or during the long, quiet hours of a night shift. The physical site of the factory in American Samoa, meanwhile, became a haunting symbol of the fragility of industrial promises. As the jungle reclaimed the corrugated metal and the tropical rain washed away the last traces of the 2000 massacre, the island began the slow process of collective forgetting. For the local Samoan population, the Dewusa case was a painful interruption of their traditional way of life, a reminder that their islands were not as isolated from the dark currents of global exploitation as they had hoped. The case prompted a period of intense reflection on the Fa'asamoa values of hospitality and protection, leading to a renewed emphasis on community oversight of foreign businesses. The islands remained a place of immense natural beauty, but there is a quiet, somber understanding among the elders that the soil of Pago Pago once bore witness to a level of depravity that was fundamentally at odds with the spirit of the Samoan people. The factory is gone, but the lesson remains. That vigilance is the only true defense against those who would trade human dignity for a marginal increase in profit. As we reach the final reflections of this long and harrowing series, we must return to the image of the woman who lost her eye, the victim whose injury became the most visceral evidence of the management's cruelty. Her story is the heart of the Dewusa narrative, a reminder that the costs of production are often paid in the most personal and permanent ways imaginable. She did not just lose an organ, she lost her sense of safety, her career, and her ability to view the world without a physical reminder of her trauma. Yet, her decision to stand in that courtroom, to point her finger at the men who had blinded her, and to demand that they be held accountable, is one of the most powerful acts of courage in the history of labor rights. She represents the millions of invisible workers who are the foundation of our global economy, people whose names we never know but whose labor we rely on every single day. Her victory was not just a personal one. It was a victory for the very idea that a human being is not a disposable commodity. The Dewusa Samoa case is a story that refuses to be neatly categorized as a thing of the past. It is a living warning that as long as there is a demand for cheap goods and a supply of vulnerable, desperate people, the slaughterhouse will always find a new place to set up shop. It challenges us to be better consumers, better citizens, and better human beings. It asks us to look at the world not as a series of disconnected markets, but as a single, shared human community where the suffering of a worker in a remote Pacific territory is our collective responsibility. The women of Dewusa fought a war that they never asked for, and they won a peace that they had to build with their own hands. As we close this chapter, let us honor their struggle by refusing to let their story fade into the rust and the jungle. Let us remember that the light of justice only stays bright if we are willing to provide the fuel of our attention, our empathy, and our unyielding demand for truth. The echoes of the November massacre may be faint now, but they still carry a message that we ignore at our own peril. that there is no price low enough to justify the theft of a human soul. This concludes the 9th part of our comprehensive look at the Daewoo Samoa tragedy. We have traveled from the recruitment centers of Vietnam to the industrial barracks of Pago Pago, through the violence of the cafeteria and the sterile halls of the federal courts, and finally into the quiet, complex aftermath of the survivors' lives. We have seen the worst of humanity in the greed of Kilsuli and the best of humanity in the resilience of his victims. It is a story of a modern-day slave plantation that was dismantled not by an army, but by the courage of its captives. May we never forget what they endured, and may we always strive to ensure that their story is the last of its kind. As we reach the final, quietest chapter of this long and harrowing journey through the shadows of the Pacific, it is necessary to look at the world as it exists today. More than a quarter of a century after the first scream echoed across the linoleum floor of the Daewoo factory, the year 2000 feels like a lifetime ago, a different era of technology, global politics, and human rights awareness. Yet the tremors from the November 28th massacre continue to vibrate through the halls of justice and the lives of those who survived. To walk the shores of Pago Pago in 2026 is to witness a landscape that has largely finished its work of reclamation. The jungle, with its relentless, emerald hunger, has almost entirely swallowed the site where Kilsuli once stood as a self-appointed god of industry. The rusted skeletons of the barracks are now home only to the local fauna and the humid, tropical wind. But while the physical evidence of the slaughterhouse has been reclaimed by the earth, the moral and legal evidence remains etched into the very foundation of how the modern world defines human dignity. The Daewoo case was not just a localized tragedy. It was the birth of a new era of global vigilance, a moment when the United States had to look in the mirror and acknowledge that slavery was not a ghost of the 19th century, but a living, breathing monster thriving under the protection of its own flag. The survivors of Daewoo, many of whom are now entering the twilight of their lives, have become the quiet, unheralded pioneers of the modern anti-trafficking movement. Their transition from the status of human machinery to that of American citizens was the final, most significant defeat for Kilsuli. In cities across the American mainland, from the humid stretches of the Gulf Coast to the bustling immigrant enclaves of the Pacific Northwest, these women have built lives that are a profound, daily defiance of their former captor. They are the grandmothers who tell stories of a distant island, not as a paradise, but as a forge where their spirits were tested and ultimately proven unbreakable. They are the workers who, for the first time in their lives, understand the value of their own labor and the protection of a paycheck that cannot be taken away. However, the American dream they eventually found is a complicated one, layered with the persistent, phantom pains of their trauma. The woman who was blinded in the cafeteria carries her darkness as a permanent badge of her courage, a physical reminder that her sight was the price she paid for her sister's freedom. Her life today, though quiet and far removed from the headlines, is a testament to a resilience that is almost impossible for the comfortable observer to truly comprehend. The legal legacy of the Daewoo case is perhaps the most significant and enduring pillar of this story. Before this trial, the prosecution of human trafficking in the United States was often a fragmented and inconsistent effort, hampered by laws that did not fully grasp the psychological complexities of modern coercion. The Daewoo case changed all of that. It was the first time the Trafficking Victims Protection Act TVPA was used to dismantle a major, transnational criminal enterprise. And the precedents set in that courtroom have since been used to free thousands of others. The case taught federal investigators that a locked door is not the only way to imprison a human being. A confiscated passport, a fraudulent debt, and the threat of deportation are just as effective. This understanding has led to a total restructuring of the FBI's Civil Rights Division and the Department of Justice's approach to labor exploitation. Today, the Samoa model is studied in law schools and police academies as the definitive example of why we must look beyond physical shackles to find the truth of modern-day slavery. The survivors of Daewoo did more than just win a case. They helped to rewrite the moral code of a nation, ensuring that the law now speaks for those who were once considered invisible. However, as we reflect on this victory, we must also confront the sobering reality that the conditions that allowed DeWusa to exist have not vanished from the global stage. The shadow factories have not disappeared. They have simply moved further into the periphery, away from the watchful eyes of federal investigators and human rights monitors. In the decades since Kilsuli was led away in handcuffs, new versions of his empire have emerged in the electronics factories of Southeast Asia, the fishing fleets of the deep oceans, and the agricultural fields of Europe. The debt bondage that broke the families of rural Vietnam is still a thriving industry, a parasitic system that feeds on the desperation of those seeking a better life. The DeWusa story is a reminder that the fight for human rights is not a war that can be won with a single trial, but a constant, exhausting struggle that requires the vigilance of every consumer and every citizen. The clothes we wear, the phones we hold, and the food we eat are still too often the products of hands that are not truly free. The legacy of the women in Samoa is a challenge to all of us to stay awake, to ask the difficult questions about the origins of our comforts, and to refuse to accept a world where profit is built on the foundation of human misery. The personal fate of Kilsuli himself serves as a final, grim footnote to this epic of exploitation. His 40-year sentence was a clear declaration that the American legal system would not tolerate the commodification of human life, regardless of the perpetrator's wealth or influence. For the survivors, knowing that the man who had starved and beaten them was spending his final years in a federal cell was a necessary part of their healing. It was the final stripping away of his power, a reversal of the hierarchy he had so carefully constructed in Pago Pago. In prison, he was no longer a check-in or a master of industry. He was simply a number, a man whose legacy was defined by the very people he had tried to destroy. His downfall proved that while the wheels of justice in the Pacific may turn slowly, they eventually grind the arrogant and the cruel into the dust of history. The contrast between his solitary, confined life and the free, albeit difficult, lives of his former workers is the ultimate justice of this story. In American Samoa, the memory of the factory has settled into a quiet, introspective part of the island's identity. The local community has spent the last quarter century reclaiming the values of Fa Samoa, the traditional Samoan way of life that emphasizes family, respect, and the protection of the guest. The DeWusa case was a profound shock to a culture that prides itself on hospitality, a violation of the sacred bond between a host and a visitor. Today, the island is a place of renewed vigilance, with stronger local protections for guest workers and a deep-seated suspicion of any industrial venture that promises too much and offers too little transparency. The mountains of Tutuila still watch over the harbor, their emerald peaks a silent witness to both the horror of 2000 and the peace of 2026. The island has healed its physical scars, but the story of the slaughterhouse remains a part of its oral history. A cautionary tale passed down to ensure that the mistakes of the past are never repeated. As we bring this podcast series to a close, we are left with the image of the vast, indifferent Pacific Ocean, the same ocean that once acted as a prison for the hundreds of women trapped in DeWusa. For a long time, the ocean was their enemy, the barrier that kept them from their homes and their families. But today, that same ocean is a bridge. It is a symbol of the connection between the villages of Vietnam and the cities of America, a reminder that we are all part of a single, global human family. The survivors of DeWusa taught us that there is no such thing as a remote tragedy. Every life matters, and every act of cruelty, no matter how far away it occurs, is an affront to our collective humanity. The story of the DeWusa factory is a dark one, but it is ultimately a story of light. It is a story of the light that broke through the corrugated metal walls, the light that shone in the eyes of the women who refused to be broken, and the light of truth that finally exposed the crimes of Kilsuli to the world. To our listeners, we ask that you carry the names of these survivors with you. Remember the woman who lost her eye, and the women who lost their youth, and the families who lost their homes. Their courage is the reason this story exists, and their resilience is the reason it has a hopeful ending. The American dream is not a gift that is given. It is a promise that must be fought for, protected, and shared. The women of Dewusa fought for it with their blood, and they won it with their truth. As you go about your day, in a world that is a little safer and a little more just because of them, take a moment to reflect on the power of a single voice to change the course of history. The silence of the Dewusa factory today is not a sign of forgetting. It is a sign of peace, a peace that was earned through the most profound struggle imaginable. This concludes our 10-part investigation into the Dewusa Samoa massacre. We have journeyed from the initial recruitment lies to the horrors of the factory floor, through the chaos of the November massacre and the complexity of the federal investigation, and finally into the lasting legacy of the survivors' lives. It has been a story of extreme contrasts. The beauty of a tropical island against the ugliness of an industrial slaughterhouse, the arrogance of a predator against the dignity of his prey, and the coldness of a criminal enterprise against the warmth of a human spirit that refuses to die. We hope that this series has not only informed you but moved you to see the world with a more vigilant and compassionate eye. The fight against modern slavery continues every day, in every corner of the globe, and it is a fight that belongs to all of us. Let us honor the women of Dewusa by refusing to let their story end with a podcast. Let us honor them by being the generation that finally makes the slaughterhouse a thing of the absolute past. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your commitment to the truth. We will be back soon with another deep dive into the cases that define our world and the people who fight for justice in the face of impossible odds. Until then, stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and never forget the cost of the freedom we so often take for granted. This has been a chronicle of the Dewusa Samoa tragedy, a journey into the heart of a Pacific nightmare and the triumph of the human will. Good night, and may the light of justice continue to reach even the furthest shores.